지금
We would like to begin the 2020 Online Translators Conference. Thank you for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. I am the MC of this conference. I am Chung Eun-gui, professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. First of all, I would like to extend my thanks to all of the participants who are joining us online. The Translators Conference invites translators to Korea and discusses issues on literary translation, and its first conference was held in 2007. In 2015, we had the conference in Seoul, and we are having this Translators Conference this year for the first time in 5 years. And because of the COVID-19, we have moved this conference this year online. With the contagion of COVID-19 across the world, we are seeing many changes in the literary translation field. So we would like to share the changes and also discuss strategies for literary translation going forward. And this is going to be a very meaningful event in that regard. All of the presentations have been pre-recorded, and for the discussions, we will be broadcasting them online, live. The first speech will be given by President Kim Sa-in of Literature Translation Institute of Korea. He will be giving some remarks of welcome. We will see his opening address on video.
안녕하십니까. 저희 한국문학번역원은 지난 2015년 대회 이후 중단됐던 세계번역가 대회를 복원하기로 했습니다. 어려운 시기일수록 같은 길을 걷는 이들 간의 동지적인 연대, 또 미래를 향한 공동모색 이런 것이 더 소중하다고 생각했습니다. 온라인 형식의 불편함을 무릅쓰고 그래서 토론의 자리를 이렇게 준비합니다. 지구상의 물적, 지적 교류의 양이 증대하면 할수록 번역의 기묘함과 또 번역의 중차대함이 다시 새롭게 부각되고 있습니다. 그 중에서도 문학 번역은 특별합니다. 번역은, 특히 문학 번역은 창작에 준하는 재능과 헌신을 요하는 영역이라고 여겨서 그것을 가르치는 일은 규범화하거나 체계화하는 것이 불가능하다 하는 입장이 있는가 하면은 반대로 워드 프로세서의 출현 이후 손글씨가 쇠락했듯이 기계 번역이 발전하면서 이제 인간 번역은 설 자리가 점차 없어지리라는 풍문도 들립니다. 동시에 번역에 있어서 기계와 인간들 사이의 생산적인 협업을 제안하는 목소리도 적지 않습니다. 모쪼록 이번 대회가 문학과 번역의 본질, 또 그 번역의 가능성과 불가능성이라는 오랜 물음을 다시 한번 상기하고 나아가서 문학 번역 교육에 관한 여러 언어권의 경험과 지혜를 함께 나누는 소중한 자리가 되기를 기대합니다. 한자리에 모여서 악수를 나눌 수 있을 시간이 머지않아 오리라고 믿습니다. 번역의 어려운 길을 자신의 소명으로 삼은 모든 분들의 건승을 진심으로 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim, who is the president of LTI Korea, is a researcher and educator of translation, and he also has published several books of poetry. And Liking in Silence is the title of his collection of poetry published in English. It's been published in the US, so if you're interested, please grab a copy. Next, we will invite Dr. Uchang Kim of Korea University, who is the Emeritus Professor of the university. And his presentation is on the title of Thoughts on Translation. His keynote speech is also delivered in video.
번역에 대해서 뭘 쓸까 하니까 뭐 할 얘기 없어요. 그래서 번역의 테두리, 번역이 뭐에 기여하는가 여기에 대해서 좀 얘기를 하려고 했습니다. 글에서는 주로 기독교에서 어떤 종류의 정전, 캐논, 중요한 텍스트가 성립했는가 이 얘기를 한 거, 이것을 참조해서 번역이 거기에 관계된 얘기를 했습니다. 그런데 간단히 생각하면은 번역이라는 거 별별 것이 아닌 것 같은데 실제 번역이 많은 걸 해내죠. 그래서 가령 이태리에서 르네상스라는 걸 생각하면 르네상스는 여러 가지에서 번역의 기초에 있다고 할 수 있어요. 그러니까 지금 서양에 있어서의 학문의 전통을 생각하면은 기독교적인 게 있고 휘랍에서 시작한 휘랍 철학적인 사고가 있고 두 가지가 있는데 이걸 전통적으로는 헬레니즘과 헤브라이즘이라고 하게 되죠. 근데 휘랍에서 한 휘랍 철학적인 사고가 서양의 문화가 일부가 된 것은 번역을 통해서죠. 어떤 번역이냐. 상당히 복잡한 경입니다. 그러니까 휘랍 철학이 아랍어로 번역됐다가 아랍어가 다시 휘랍어로 번역되고 그것이 라틴어로 번역되고 그래서 서양에 있어서 일반적인 고전적인 경전으로 정착이 되게 됐습니다. 그러니까 특히 르네상스 때 여기 글에서는 그걸 많이 얘기 안 했지만 르네상스 때를 보면은 아랍어에서 다시 휘랍어와 라틴어로 온 휘랍 철학 이게 굉장히 중요한 역할을 하게 되죠. 그러니까 아랍을 거쳐서 다시 서구의 문은 학문적 전통이 생기게 된 겁니다. 여기 이 글에서는 주로 박승찬 교수가 가톨릭대에 계신 박승찬 교수가 어떻게 서양에서 기독교와 휘랍 문화 전통이 합쳐서 하나의 흐름을 이루게 됐는가. 그래서 설명한 것에 의존해서 그 얘기를 했습니다. 이것은 번역이 많이 들어가는 거죠. 그러니까 아까 얘기한 것처럼 휘랍어 학문이 서양으로 들어온 데는 아랍어를 거쳐서 들어오게 됐기 때문에 그것도 상당히 복잡한 거죠. 근데 여기서 이 박승찬 교수가 얘기하는 건 그런 아랍에서 휘랍으로 들어간 유럽으로 들어간 문학보다도 주로 어떻게 해서 서양에서 이 기독교적인 전통이 생겼는가 이걸 얘기를 했습니다. 기독교적인 그런 문화가 생기는 데는 휘랍 철학이 기독교가 아니면서도 매우 중요한 역할을 하게 되죠. 그래서 이 박승찬 교수가 계속해서 강조하는 것처럼 거기에는 이성의 문제가 있고 신앙의 문제가 있습니다. 근데 서양에 있어서 기독교 전통도 그렇고 철학을 포함해서 또 문학이나 역사에서도 이 세속적인 학문 전통에는 휘랍적인 게 상당히 들어있습니다. 이것을 합쳐서 박승찬 교수는 종교와 철학, 종교와 학문 이렇게 구분하기도 하고 거기에 작용하는 인간의 심성 어떤 요소를 뽑아가지고 양심과 의식 또 양심과 이성 이렇게도 얘기를 하게 됩니다. 그래서 다시 얘기하면 서양 전통에 있어서 중심에 있는 것은 이성인데 그 이성에 합쳐서 또 양심이라는 게 있다. 그래서 이 두 개가 합쳐서 어떻게 서양 사상적인 또 사상의 표현을 중심되는가 이 얘기가 그 박승찬 교수의 글에 나옵니다. 이것은 번역과 관계에서 얘기하면 아까 아랍어에 거쳐서 휘랍 철학이 서양으로 다시 돌아온다 그랬는데, 휘랍 철학하고 유태교의 히브리, 유태교의 경전들이 쓰여있는 히브리어하고도 합치게 되고, 또 그 당시에 중동 지방에 사용되던 아라마이어도 거기에 관계되게 됩니다. 또 서양 일반 대중을 향해서 중요한 성경이 형성되는 데는 그것이 독일어로도 번역되고 영어로도 번역돼야 되죠. 또 우리나라에서도 이 성경이라든지 기독교의 신학적인 이해가 성립하는 데는 우리말 성경이 이르게 됐어야 됩니다. 번역이라는 것은 그냥 그때그때의 필요에 의해서 이루어지는 것이다. 그리고 번역이라는 것은 번역자나 출판사가 원고료나 인쇄를 받기 위해서 한다. 이렇게 생각하지만 사실은 그 테두리를 이루고 있는 것은 이러한 정전의 전통을 만드는 데 있다. 그래서 정전의 형성에 기여하는 게 번역행위다. 이런 얘기를 했습니다. 그러면 번역행위는 어디서 시작하냐면 지금 말한 것처럼 인쇄라든지 원고료라든지 이런 것에 의해서 충돌이 되는 것 같지만은 그 밑에 들어있는 깊은 것을 보면 그러한 학문적 전통을 수립하는 데 관계가 있다. 번역이 모여서 그런 것을 이루게 된다. 이런 얘기를 했습니다. 그런데 번역도 그렇고 학문하는 것도 그렇고 그 밑에 들어있는 것은 사람이 가지고 있는 호기심이죠. 뭘 알고 싶어하는 것이 있는데 그것을 자연 세계에 있는 것들을 알고 싶어하기도 하고 사람이 있으면 사람에 대해서 알고 싶어하기도 하지만 또 다른 나라 내가 모르는 말로 쓰여 있는 것이 있으면 그걸 또 알고 싶어합니다. 그러니까 그런 것이 본능적으로 작용하게 되죠. 그러니까 다시 말해서 우리 심성에서는 뭘 알고 싶어하는 것이 있고 또 우리의 물질적인 요소로서는 원고료라든지 인쇄라든지 이런 게 있지만 그런 것은 사실 자기도 모르게 큰 정전, 어떤 문화적인 전통을 형성하는 데서 아주 중요한 역할을 한다. 네, 아까 얘기한 것처럼 이성과 양심, 이 두 개를 발전시키는 게 서양에 있어서의 문화적인 전통이고 거기에는 휘랍어, 히브리어, 아라마이어, 라틴어 이런 것들이 관계되어 있다. 이런 얘기를 했습니다. 또 우리나라 경우를 조금 더 얘기하면 우리나라에서는 최창현이라는 분이 18세기 말에 처음으로 성경 번역을 했어요. 그것은 성경 직해라는 걸 했는데 그 다음에 다시 또 다른 분들이 그걸 계속해서 하고 그래서 여러 사람들이 참여해서 성경 같은 게 이루어졌습니다. 그런 것을 통해서 성경이라는 걸 만들고 성경을 통해서 두 가지 것이 확립이 됐는데 하나는 이성적인 의식하고 한 개는 양심하고 한데 주의해야 될 것은 이성적인 인식은 모든 사람이 나누어 가질 수 있는 거고 양심은 어떤 개체만이 한 사람만이 가질 수 있는 거죠. 그러니까 이 양심에 따라서 행동하기 위해서는 이성적인 것으로 벗어날 수도 있어요. 그래서 여기서 테르툴리아누스라는 이 박승찬 교수의 강연에 나오는 사람을 번역을 소개를 해서 불합리하기 때문에 나는 믿는다. 이런 얘기가 나온다고 그랬습니다. 그래서 양심에 따라서 행동한다는 것은 보통 공통적으로 합리적으로 이게 옳다고 하는 것하고는 상당히 안 맞아 들어가는 경우가 많아요. 그래서 한 테두리로서 양심과 이성을 만든다고 하지만 한쪽으로는 양심이라는 이성에 어긋나는 어떤 거하고 또 이성은 모든 사람을 포괄하는 이치하고 이 두 개가 합쳐서 문화전통을 이루게 되고 기독교라는 게 그렇게 된다. 그러면서 다시 한번 내가 뒤에서 강조하는 게 뭐냐면은 이건 하나의 문화전통, 주로 이성적 전통, 양심이라는 게 있지만 그러긴 하지만은 양심이라는 것이 강조되기 때문에 양심은 행동을 위해서 필요한 것이고 또 사람마다 다 다르고 그 양심은 이성만이 아니라 우리 감정상태 관계가 많다. 근데 번역할 때 감정상태도 번역하는 경우가 많은데 그건 어떻게 하느냐. 그건 시 같은 것을 번역하면은 시는 얼른 보기에는 하나의 이 정서, 감정을 표현하는 것 같지만 그것은 또 다른 합리적인 이성적인 전통 또 사회적인 전통 이런 것을 다 포괄한다. 그래서 여기에서 내가 예로서 들면서 하나만 들면은 김서월을 진달래 꽃 나보기에 가실 때는 말없이 거기 보내드리오리다 하는 그걸 얘기하면서 그 진달래 꽃을 따가지고 그런 영변의 약산 진달래꽃 아름다다 가시는 길에 뿌리오리다 할 때 왜 사람 가는데 여기가 꽃을 뿌리느냐 할 때 그것은 꽃을 이별하는 것을 화려하게 만들기 위해서다. 이것은 뭘 의미하느냐. 그것은 이별이고 또 다른 것이고 사람 사는데 어떤 일정한 질서를 가지고 의식을 하는 것들이 있다. 사람 죽은 경우도 그런 의식이 있다. 이런 얘기를 했어요. 죽음이라는 건 인생이 없어지는 것인데 그런 경우도 굉장히 화려한 잔치를 하게 되죠. 그러니까 소월은 그 이별을 매우 화려하게 잔치하겠다 하는 뜻에서 진달래꽃이라는 걸 썼다. 근데 이것은 다른 나라 말로 번역할 때는 도저히 전달이 안 된다. 그래서 이학수 교수라고 UCLA에 계시는 피터 리라고 영어로는 그분이 번역한 영어를 다시 꺼내놨습니다. 그 영어 번역으로는 진달래꽃에서 나와 있는 그 예의 바른 높임 말로 존대어로 쓴 글을 도저히 영어로는 표현할 수가 없어요. 그래서 시적 언어 같은 것은 특정한 감정, 특정한 정서를 표현하고 특정한 개인의 위치를 표현하고 또 특정한 문화를 표현한다. 그래서 거기서 우리가 배울 수 있는 것은 문화가 커진다는 것은 한쪽으로 이성적인 질서가 생긴다는 거지만 또 다른 한쪽으로는 개인의 이성적인 질서에 어긋나는 여러 가지 양심적인 절차도 인정한다. 그래서 문화가 발전한다는 것은 다 하나로 이성적인 질서로 모인다는 얘기가 되기도 하고 또 모든 사람이 다 자기 양심에 따라서 살 수 있는 개인적인 존재를 실체를 인정하는 것이 되기도 한다. 이런 뜻에서 마지막 얘기를 했습니다. 그래서 번역한다는 것은 매우 하찮은 일 같아 보이지만 사실은 이러한 문화적인 정통성을 만들어내는데 핵심적인 일을 하는 것이다. 그러면서 또 우리가 잊어버리서는 안 되는 것이 그러한 전통에서 하나하나를 개별적인 그 독자성을 인정하는 것. 이것이 현대적인 전통의 핵심이다. 이런 얘기를 했습니다. 우리나라에서 그걸 잘 모르는 것 같아요. 모두와 하나가 됩시다. 이렇게는 얘기하지만은 하나가 된다는 것은 또 동시에 서로 따로따로 산다는 것도 포함한다는 거. 이것을 잘 인정을 안 하는 것 같아요. 근데 이 번역의 경우도 그렇죠. 번역하면서 우리는 세계적인 걸 우리 안으로 들여오지만 또 동시에 우리 것은 우리 것으로 독자적이고 우리 것만이 아니라 모든 사람이 독자적인 존재라는 거, 한 단위 존재라는 게 독자적인 존재라는 거, 이런 것을 알게 된다. 이런 것이 번역에 들어있고 문화전통에 들어있고 그런 문화전통을 수립하는 것이 문화와 학문에 종사하는 사람들의 소명인 것이다. 이런 게 내가 여기서 얘기한 내용입니다.
감사합니다, 교수.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. Professor Kim is a scholar of English literature, and he's also a literary critic, and he's a leading scholar in the humanities. And his keynote speech is titled Some Thoughts on Translation. And he has provided us with very in-depth and profound thoughts on how translation contributes to a broader understanding of the humanity and also has given birth to reason and conscience. So thank you very much for that insightful keynote. Now we will move into the main sessions. The first presenter of the first session is Mr. Chris Gribble, CEO of National Center for Writing of the United Kingdom. Right now it's morning time in UK. And Mr. Chris Gribble will be delivering a presentation on the title of Literary
Hello, my name is
Translation,
Chris
Education
Gribble,
and
the
Strategy.
Chief Exec of the National Centre for Writing in Norwich, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today, even if it is virtually. The National Centre for Writing is a development agency for writers, literary translators, and the broader literary arts, and we're based in Norwich, 2 hours from London on England's east coast. We have a city of 1,000 years history of writers being celebrated. Our vibrant community scene, we are home to the University of East Anglia, who pioneered the teaching of creative writing in the United Kingdom, which is also celebrating its 50th anniversary of creative writing teaching this year, and home to the country's busiest public library, amongst other things. Our commitment is to making writing, reading, and literary translation part of our city's future offer to our country, our global network, and everybody who lives and visits our city. Hello also to our sister cities of literature in Bucheon and Wonju. It's lovely to see you here. I'm here today to talk about the work we do with literary translation in particular. We believe strongly that translators are as creative, important, and worthy of investment of writers, and without literary translators, words and stories and cultures and understanding cannot travel. This presentation will cover three main areas of our work: the International Literary Translation and Creative Writing Summer School, our partnership with the British Centre for Literary Translation. Secondly, our Emerging Translators Mentoring Programme. And finally, a programme called Visible Communities, something we run which helps explore how translation plays different roles in communities and different languages. Some context for you. The National Centre for Writing used to be called Writers' Centre Norwich. We were founded in 2004, but after a capital programme, we opened our current home in the beautiful medieval hall, Dragon's Hall, in 2018. Writers' Centre and National Centre for Writing operates a range of programmes and activities. It's important to note, however, that we are not a university. We do not train or educate literary translators in the same way that universities do, and we don't offer degree courses that might lead to qualifications. We sit in a really interesting place, that place between where people who might want to be writers or translators start from and where they want to end up in the practical, professional world of being writers or literary translators. And we help them on their journey between the first place and the second place. We help them with their artistic journey, their technical and professional journey, and we help make them and equip them to be the professionals that they wish to become. I should also note that our key partners in this activity are the University of East Anglia and the British Centre for Literary Translation, which is itself a part of the University of East Anglia. They do offer degree programmes in literary translation, and we work very closely with them. The University of East Anglia was the first university in the United Kingdom to teach creative writing at master's level, and that programme started 50 years ago, as I mentioned, in 1970. In their very first year, there was only one graduate of that programme. That person happened to be Ian McEwan, so they've done very well and they're carrying on doing very well now. We work closely with UEA and many other partners on our programmes, and we particularly like to thank LTI Korea and Arts Council Korea for their support in the work that we do. Now I'd like to talk about the first project, the Bclt National Centre for Writing International Summer School for Literary Translation and Creative Writing. It's really true that literary translation can be an isolated career. It's also true that there aren't very many places, certainly in the United Kingdom, where you can study literary translation. The Bclt NCW Summer School is a really important coming together point for emerging or early career literary translators, where they can spend time together outside of a formal professional qualification, where they can talk with each other, where they can network, where they can learn from professional practitioners of literary translation, where they can meet publishers, meet agents, and perhaps most importantly of all, find out about the ways that they might develop in their future career and also spend time with each other, developing a cohort and a network of partners. The summer school offers peer learning through workshops as well as networking and industry experience. We run non-specific language workshops as well as workshops in all sorts of individual languages that cover the whole world. In recent years, the languages and countries that we've covered have included Bulgaria, Myanmar, Argentina, Mexico, United States, Singapore, as well as the languages of the United Kingdom and many other minorized languages from around the world. The key features of the Bclt NCW Summer School are that we work in small networked groups which work in collaborative translation contexts. Individual groups spend a week together working intensively on a text with the author of that text so that they can really understand, explore, and get to know the piece of text that they're translating and learn about the dynamics of that literary translation. We also include creative writing sessions for the literary translators. We want to explore the intersection between the act of literary translation and creative writing as a way to encourage literary translators to understand and identify with the creative process that the writers have gone through and help identify their journey as well. We also undertake Training the Trainers program, a way of helping educate literary translators to become the trainers of other translators, to share the best ideas from around the world about the teaching of literary translation, its pedagogy, and also the methodologies and different understandings of literary translation teaching. This strand is a mixture of peer learning, where trainers observe workshops, undertake experiments in different styles, and reflect on their learning with experienced teachers of translators. In response to COVID-19, the 2020 summer school went online, and it was a really interesting experience for us. We had over 240 applications for 70 places on the program, and one of our program participants came back to us and said that this year the summer school was a resounding success. It was fun and hugely productive. You have proved so many points and broken new ground. Maybe there should be an alternative online and in real life summer school every year so that it continues to be accessible to wonderful far-flung people and those with too many commitments or financial constraints to be away for a whole week. We hope to explore the online summer school in future as well. The second key program that we run is our Emerging Translators Mentoring Program. It was brilliant news that the fantastic news yesterday was that the Korean Poetry Translation Prize went to a translator called Mato Mandaslut and Jeong Ra-young, who was a Korean poet who was in residence here in Norwich last year. Mato took part in the 2018-19 early emerging translator mentoring program, and his quote to us was that, "For me, the Emerging Translators Mentorship did just what its name suggests. It helped me emerge. No translator will get published from nothing. There are editors who need convincing. I got to be mentored by someone who single-handedly managed to jump that hurdle herself when she published The Vegetarian, Deborah Smith. The absolute trailblazer she continues to be, her advice was nothing short of crucial as I began navigating the wondrous worlds of publishing." You can see from that quotation that the Emerging Translators Mentoring Program is a very powerful 8-month program where individual translators are paired with the very best emerging translators in a whole range of languages to help them develop in the art and craft of their work, to connect them with the publishing and translation industry, to help them navigate the start of their career, maintain contacts and develop a professional network, and to help them develop a broad range of understanding about what a translation career might exist in. It takes place over 6 months. The focus for each individual emerging translator is a combination of skills development, industry contacts, learning about the wider aspects of a career. They meet with their mentor a minimum of 4 times during that period of time, sometimes physically, sometimes face-to-face. At the moment, it's nearly all virtual, but often it is face-to-face as well. We also bring together the whole cohort of translators and their mentors here in Dragon Hall in Norwich to give them a weekend together where they can talk, meet professionals, prepare to go to the London Book Fair, where we host and take part in the Literary Translation Centre each year, and develop a small anthology publication of their work, which we can share with publishers. And it's a really incredibly powerful programme that has developed some of the best translators working today, and we're very proud of this. It was started by Daniel Hahn 10 years ago, and we're celebrating our anniversary this year. Finally, our Visible Communities programme is something that we run directly in response to the fact that we're very aware we're having English as our first language, that it has a global role of dominance, strength, and sometimes overexposure. We're aware that there are other languages, both in our countries and internationally, that are less translated, that are less focused on by the publishing industry, that are given less esteem and value than English. So we wanted to explore, through literary translation, different ways for languages to gain more exposure and more presence in the publishing industries, and also to highlight the positive role that literary translation can play as a life skill in classrooms and communities. Visible Communities exists to diversify access routes to literary translation, to help us identify Black and Brown translators who are underrepresented in the literary translation world, to strengthen links between the literary translation community, heritage speakers of languages and diaspora communities, and underrepresented literary translation communities. We want to contribute to the debate around decolonizing literature and literary translation, and also ultimately make available a larger, wider range of texts and stories from many different languages to readers in our country and internationally. We do a range of things in the Visible Communities programme. We work with students of literary translators here in Norwich and also in London and in Oxford with partners to help them work in classrooms to become ambassadors for literary translation, to work with children and young people to show them what a powerful tool and skill and superpower literary translation can be. Making stories travel between cultures and languages is a wonderful skill. We work with schools to explore how literary translation can fit into their curricula. We work with the Literature Must Fall project, a decolonizing translation program to help decenter English from the literary translation canon and explore and give room to other languages. We provide residencies and opportunities for Black and Brown literary translators here in Norwich. And we're also planning to publish an anthology of work on decolonizing literary translation with Deborah Smith's publishing house, Tilted Access Press. We do a range of work face-to-face for literary translators over the year in festivals, events, programs, talent development programs, and the summer school. The COVID-19 pandemic has really changed things for us. We've had to work a lot online, and good things and bad things have emerged from that experience. We have realized that we can reach more people with our events and programs online than we could physically, but sometimes it's harder to make the quality of the conversation and the engagement as deep as it is in real life. We have brought our literary translation residencies into the virtual realm. We are hosting at the minute translators from Norway and shortly from other places in the world in virtual residencies in Norwich, which is wonderful. They can engage with our programs and our writers, but they can't physically be here in the city to meet young people, to meet other translators, and to really experience life here, which is a great shame. Our summer school with Bclt, as I said, went virtual this year. 65 places, 200 applications, and we had translators from all over the world taking part. It was great fun, it was really accessible, but it won't ever replace the physical experience of being together, and we do hope that at some point we get back to that. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you today. Do please get in touch with me if you have any questions, suggestions, or thoughts about our programs. We love hearing from people. We love talking to both our sister cities of literature in Korea and people from all over the world. It's been my pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gribble. He has introduced to us a very important institution in the United Kingdom, which is the National Center for Writing, and also and all the various programs that they offer in partnership with other institutions. And I think these programs can shed light on what we could do at LTI Korea as well. Next, we will hear a presentation by Mr. Jürgen Jakob Becker, who is the Managing Director of Literary Colloquium Berlin in Germany. And Mr. Becker will be speaking on the topic of an Academy for the Art of Translation, Literary Translation
Hello,
Education
my
by
name
the
is
German
Jürgen
Translators
Jakob
Fund.
Becker, and I'm representing the Deutscher Übersetzerfonds, the German Translators Fund. This is an organization that was founded in 1997 and funded by the federal government of Germany to strengthen a culture of translation in Germany. The Übersetzerfonds is an initiative that comes from professional literary translators. They worked to build up this organization, and now we are very important in Germany, the main institution in Germany to support literary translators. We award grants to literary translators. We run a so-called Academy of the Art of Translation. And we support literary translators in actively exercising their role as mediators between cultures and language areas. So we are doing a lot of projects, we are doing events, publications, and so on. What I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about the Academy of the Art of Translation, which is a kind of an innovative thing in Germany, because there is no standardized training for literary translators in Germany. We have only very few universities like Düsseldorf or Munich that offer master's or postgraduate degrees and courses for literary translators. And they are mostly limited to translators from English and French. And only a few of these graduates managed to gain a foothold in the literary world. The most professionals have come to literary translation via detours. That means that perhaps is a good thing. Literary translators not only have to be enthusiastic and master a foreign language from which they translate, they also have to have a literary education, reading experience, and of course an experience of the world. And of course they must have the literary talent to create texts that meet literary standards. This is where a sense of style, of linguistic sensitivity, an ear for the right tone comes into play, and which has to be developed, not unlike the musical interpreter, through practice and training. All this is a process of lifelong learning. The diversity of daily practice is immense, but it must be supplemented by meaningful in-service training opportunities. And this Academy of the Art of Translation, which we have built up, has created a large number of such forums which serve to further the training of literary translators, to promote discussion and reflection on quality standards and translation strategies, and to promote the translator's own writing skills. They are derived from the practice of literary translation and are passed on by authors, critics, and experienced practitioners of the profession in the form of seminars. Translators, editors, critics, they benefit from the Academy's events. The workshops usually last 3 to 7 days. They are designed as training courses that are free of charge for the participants and for which they must apply. Normally, one applies with a current, unfinished translation, which is also discussed in the workshop. The seminars can be divided into different categories. So the first one, which I just want to mention is the language pair related seminar, which is maybe the classical form of a seminar for a group working with the same or the closely related source languages, like German, English to German. We have a group of 10 people. They all have English texts to translate into German. And the content of these workshops is always a text discussion. We talk about the typical problems of translating from English into German, for example. English and German are, of course, quite close languages, but there are a lot of traps where you can fall in. It will be about word games, about linguistic and stylistic means, how they can be refined and exploited, about metaphors, and about the sentence constructions, the way sentences work in English and German are not the same. So the second kind of seminar we have, and which is maybe the most of the seminars we offer, is the cross-lingual seminar. You have a group of people translating from several source languages into German, into the target language, German. And against the skepticism of a lot of older colleagues, the realization of these cross-language workshops makes a lot of sense and has become accepted in the meantime here in Germany. The effect of this is that the focus of the discussion shifts to the target language and thus to the decisive stylistic problems from the individual word to the sentence, to the text and the style in German. A great advantage of this approach is that translators from the smaller or less represented languages can be integrated. The variety of topics and problems addressed in this way leads to further learning effects. Just a few weeks ago in October, we had a seminar for translators from the East Asian languages, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. For the first time, we collected translators from these languages into German, and it was very good to see how intense they could work with each other. Anyone who translates from East Asian languages know how far it is to get from the original into a lively German, and how easy it is to get stuck along the way. Often, East Asian literature does not reach the readership here because the translations do not manage the final step from philological to idiomatic language. In this seminar, which is explicitly aimed at young professionals, we have looked at the stumbling blocks along the way. How do I break free from the syntax to the original? How do I learn to differentiate between language habits and style? How much strangeness do I want or should I preserve? In addition to discussing the submitted texts, we also address topics that are particularly relevant to translating from East Asian languages, such as narrative time, onomatopoeia, or the use of text composition. So this is an example where we collected translators from different languages to the target language of German. The third one is a very successful international project. It's called vice versa, the language pair-related translation workshops. So there will have translation workshops with participants from a language pair, allow and particularly intense work by concentrating on one language, on two languages. So we have 8 to 12 participants, translators from German to Russian, as well as from Russian to German, for example. In addition to the qualified response to their own work, the exchange, the workshops invite the participants to think in the other directions. In other words, a sensitization to the richness of the source language and to one's own language too. Since 2010, Vice Versa has been able to support workshops in more than 30 bilingual constellations, but not yet a German-Korean, unfortunately. The response of the participants is almost euphoric. The international workshops have become an important instrument for promoting quality and indispensable for further training and the transfer of knowledge across language barriers. So these are three kinds of seminars. The fourth point I want to make is that we go into the academic world with a guest professorship, the August Wilhelm von Schlegel Guest Professorship for Poetics of Translation, which further develops the rich tradition of reflection gained from practical experience, which goes back to Luther and Schlegel. So as you may know, German, it's a strong tradition to think about translation, to reflect the art of translation in Germany, and we have a lot of classical texts. And nowadays, I think we still have quite a high level of reflection. So you have a lot of comments, translators writing about their art, and so to bring this into the academic discussion, this is why we have this August Wilhelm von Schlegel guest professorship. And the last point is the international dimension. It's the Toledo program, which we started 2 years ago. It supports literary translators in their work as active ambassadors between cultures and languages. And the funding we offer support three primary goals: mobility. So we have mobility grants. Most of the grants are for translators of German literature into other languages. So they are invited to come to Germany to spend here a couple of weeks to work on texts or just to meet authors to get information. Of course, this program is in this year, in the Corona year, not very, has suffered a little bit, but I guess we can open it again in the next year. The networking means projects that encourage exchange between translators and with other members of the literary scene. And the visibility point is that we try to create events that make the cultural vocabulary of translators accessible to a wide audience. A core element of the Toledo program is the international meetings of translators of German literature every year in March. So then we invite 20 to 40, between 20 and 40 translators from all over the world. We have a lot of applications, and then we choose a very diverse group of 30 people maybe coming to Berlin to do a workshop and a seminar, and we also visit the Leipzig Book Fair in March. A new program we are going to start just in a few months is a cooperative form of translation, the so-called social translating project. So we'll begin with a poetry project. A German poet, Marcel Bayer, with his poems will be translated into 10 to 15 languages. So we have, and with the support of a special software, we want to create a discussion room for this. You have these two websites, Übersetzerfonds.de and Toledoprogramm.de, which maybe give a first some information about the things we offer, and I'm looking forward to the discussions we will have soon. Thank you.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Mr. Becker. So we have heard about the translation practices and also programs that's taking place in Germany. There were various seminars where the publishers and the translators come together. And also he mentioned the language pair-related seminars, and he talked about how the vice versa program in which the Korean and German pair has not been represented as yet. So perhaps that could be an opportunity that we can explore in the future. Now we're going to hear a discussion by Professor Mikyung Choi, who's a professor at the Ewha Women's University's Graduate School of Translation and Interpretation. She is going to deliver her comments on the two presentations delivered by Mr. Gribble and Mr. Becker as well. So now I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Choi.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Hello. I am professor at Ewha Women's University Graduate School of Translation and Interpretation, Korean, French, Interpretation and Translation Department. I'm also dean of that graduate school currently. So in this times of the COVID pandemic, we are experiencing a lot of challenges. And at the same time, in 2015, Ewha GSTI had hosted the previous Translators Conference, and it was quite a successful event back then, that event that we had co-hosted. And there were a lot of discussions, very meaningful discussions that had taken place on literary translation. So I'm sorry that we're having this event today only online, but it's also quite fortunate that we're able to have this event at least online. And because Korea has very strong network connection and online technology, it's quite fortunate that we are able to have this exchange with countries. And in particular, because of the pandemic, our colleagues in Europe have been in lockdown for a number of months. And so I'm expecting that you might have had more time to read literary fiction and other works of literature, and perhaps you might have read more Korean literature translated into your own language, so that might have been a blessing in disguise. So first of all, Mr. Chris Gribble has introduced us to that very lovely town and also to that National Center for Writing. I thought it was quite impressive that you train people up to the age of 80, and also that you are providing many programs and workshops to enhance the translation capabilities of Black and Brown translators. So social cohesion and community translator training seems to be one of your aims. And LTI Korea, who is the host of this conference, its goal is to promote Korean literature overseas and to translate Korean literature overseas. And your goal seems to be a little more broad-based. And listening to what you shared on the Black and Brown translators' nurturing programs, English, French, and Spanish, so those hegemonic languages and the other languages, I think there might be sort of a difference in the status of the languages within the UK as well. And Edith Grossman, I quoted in my manuscript, I found that she said that there were differences in the languages in the UK and US, though they both spoke English. And so Edith Grossman was pointing out the difficulties that she was facing as a translator for those two markets. I am a conference interpreter, but I'm also a literary translator, and I am very well aware that it is difficult to collaborate with publishers overseas. I heard from your presentation that you have ateliers with publishers overseas. I would like to know a little more how that goes along. And I believe that the Black and Brown translators, would they be also learning to translate non-English source texts? And LTI Korea provides translation training. And I would like to know, how well the translators who have been trained at NCW are established in the publishing market in reality. And I see that Mr. Becker is also online. So may I ask a question of Mr. Becker right away, or should we hear a response from Mr. Gribble before I move on to the question for Mr. Becker?
Yes, certainly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hello there.
Yes, I hear you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to your conference, and my thanks to LTI Korea and all of your colleagues for making me feel so welcome. In answer to your questions, I think that translation and work from translation struggles to get published as much as it should in the UK publishing market generally, partly because of the global dominance of the English language currently. One of our missions is to increase the range of work published in translation, but within that aim, it's to ensure that it isn't just the standard languages that get translated again and again. In recent years, the majority of work that is published in the UK in translation has tended to come from European languages, and that is incredibly rich, incredibly welcome, and incredibly important. But we are also aware that there are other languages, cultures, traditions, and stories that we aren't hearing because the amount of work in translation is limited, and within that limited amount, there's a domination of some European languages. So we work to broaden that, and therefore, as well as welcoming translators and languages from all over the world, we do just want to keep a very specific focus on translators from minorized languages, but also those who are from Black and diverse ethnic backgrounds, to ensure that their family languages, their heritage languages, which are now part of the United Kingdom's cultural context, also reach publishers and therefore reach readers. There's a lot of work to still be done. We are a small organization trying hard, but it's a big task.
네, 그런 그 노력이 사실
Thank you. Those efforts are probably align very well with the work that LTI Korea does to translate Korean literary works and translate them into foreign languages. So it's very fortunate, and I'm happy that we're having such an opportunity to discuss such commonalities in the midst of this pandemic. And because we have Mr. Jürgen Jakob Becker online as well, when I was reading your presentation manuscript, I was very much nodding my head because I could empathize with a lot of what you were writing. In particular, the cross-lingual workshops that were discussed in your presentation. I found that the Korean language was included in the East Asian languages in October. And I was happy to hear that. I would like to ask you to elaborate further on how that program went, the East Asian Language Translation Seminar workshop. And also the cross-lingual translation that goes into German and also from German into foreign languages. So this literary translation is not just about translation, but it's also about creative work. It's about writing. So the question that I have for you is, it's very important to train the translators to become very strong writers. And I also very much agreed with your viewpoint, how to distance yourself from the source text and how to provide a translation that is more idiomatic, which one is much more relatable to from the German reader. I heard that that was one of your points in the training for your translation. So that's not just about having a mastery of the language. Today we talk about the advancement of artificial intelligence and speeding up translation using AI technology. However, AI trains itself based on algorithms using the data that is entered in by people. So it's sort of a mechanical process. But literary translation requires a deverbalization, distancing from the source text, and also creativity. So literary translation requires a lot of creativity, and I believe that means it can only be done by human beings. And that was why I was agreeing so avidly with what you were talking about. And about the collaboration between editors and translators, that's very important, as Mr. Gribble mentioned earlier. One of the difficulties that Korean literature has finding readership in the European market is not only because we don't have enough trained translators, but also the publishers and editors don't know very much about Korean literature and they aren't very favorable. So the editing and the publishing actually doesn't open up. And I would like to know what kind of training or what kind of approaches are you taking to address this issue?
So thank you for inviting me. So it's an honor for me as well to speak here in this context. Just one technical remark. I always hear the Korean original and the translation at the same time. So I try to figure out the question now. The last question was about artificial intelligence and how it affects the literary translation. Is this your question?
Actually, artificial intelligence is based on mechanical process that uses algorithms and data that is fed in by people. So I believe that literary translation is something that only human beings can do. And I would like to know what your thoughts.
Yeah. At this moment of history, I would say yes, you are right. And but we see some years ago when we had meetings of translators, we had this game. We would see what is Google doing with Google Translate doing with Marcel Proust, and it always was a big fun to see what happens when Google tried to translate Marcel Proust. In the meantime, Google has improved a lot, and so the technology is going on and on. So today the discussion is a little bit different. So for example, that especially for texts with not the highest level of literature, the results are not that bad, and that some people are thinking maybe a raw version of a text can be done by the machine, and then an editor, a human editor, will work on this material. This is something that what I expect will be in the near future. This might work well with German, French, German, English, of course. For Korean, German, where we don't have that much material and the corpus is much smaller, that will take much more time. So I think it's at this moment when we talk about Korean and German, as for example, we shouldn't hope that the machines are very quick.
Yes, I think also. From Korean to German, we must work hard.
Yeah.
그리고 또
Thank you very much. And one of the other questions that I had for you was the collaboration. How are the workshops or the programs done to train the collaboration between editors and translators?
Editors and translators, yeah, they are natural collaborators for every book. So, but there is no standardized training for literary editors. And there's no standardized training for translators as well. So a lot of people come into this job just by doing it and by getting more and more experienced. And sometimes we thought it is very helpful to bring professionals from both sides together. We have a lot of translators complaining about that there is no editor at all in my publishing house. The text, nobody reads the text really. Nobody wants to work with me. There is the aim to work with texts on the side of the translator, of course. You want to improve your work and you want to have a feedback. You have problems you want to discuss. And there's nobody there but the literary editor. So this collaboration is a very important point of publishing translation. So we thought we should bring both sides together. And we have in Germany, for example, from the senior editors from who did a lot of work, they want to share their knowledge and their experiences, and we try to make something out of it. So this exchange is going very well now.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. So works of literature, it's not just circulation across languages, but it also contributes to what Goethe mentioned. Universal literature, world literature will not exist if translation does not exist. Edith Grossman also said that world literature that is worthy of academic study depends on the existence of translation, and the work of translation is a very sacred role. And at Ewha GSTI, I also teach literary translation as well as interpreting, and GSTI Ewha is one of the only institution in Korea which is providing literary translation as a formal program. And we have very ambitious and eager students. If they want to pick up linguistic skills as quickly as possible to translate texts. However, literature, as you may well know, explores all of the aspects and facets of human life, culture, history, everything. And sometimes students seem to forget that aspect. And from that regard, a little more wide, broad-based work that is being put in place by the NCW, by Mr. Gribble, is quite meaningful. And this was part of my question. The publishing houses and in the publishing landscape of the UK, do you feel that the literary publishing landscape is becoming a little more open currently?
Absolutely, yes. I think that there has been a real broadening of interest and an understanding that the readership here in this country is very hungry for stories and from literatures from around the world. I think that there was an anxiety on the part of our publishing industry that people were afraid of works in translation. That has proved not to be the case. You know, when Deborah Smith and Han Kang won the Man Booker International for The Vegetarian, you know, Han Kang came to Norwich and met Deborah here. They worked here, and then a year and a half later, that prize came, and it just created a huge groundswell of interest. And you know, we have now had 7 writers in residence from Korea in Norwich over the last 3 years, and we have published in partnership with a press here in Norwich 10 small books of new work from Korean, which are finding their way into the hands of the bigger publishers who are now able to explore the range of options, the real contemporary wealth of literature coming out of Korea. And that is happening around the world with our partnerships that we have in South Asia, with some of the Indian languages, the partnerships that we have in Japan. We are publishing some contemporary work from Japanese. And I think that if we can work with outstanding literary translators, they are able to show the publishers that the work in translation is vibrant, contemporary, exciting, and that the stories, like the wonderful introductory lecture by Professor Uchang Kim, there is both an experience or a wish to experience the unknown, but but there's also a desire to discover the things that we share in common that come through stories. So that is opening up. I think there's a real sense that English as a language is starting to examine itself and the power structures around itself in the publishing world slightly more carefully and rigorously, and that is creating some more space for other languages and literatures to emerge.
굉장히 긍정적인 답변을 주셔서 너무 감사드립니다.
Thank you very much for that very optimistic and positive response. And amidst many difficulties, the visit of Han Kang and so many good things are taking place. It's very nice to hear. And I again regret that we weren't able to invite the two of you to Korea. You might have enjoyed the beautiful autumn of Korea, and you had seen up close the enthusiasm of Koreans who want to learn more about literary translation. But since the vaccine seems to be coming to the market soon, I hope that we are going to be able to meet in person sometime soon. But of course, we can't just sit back waiting. And there are a lot of things that we can do online, and that is a very good lesson that we learned from the COVID pandemic. At Ewha Graduate School of Interpretation and Translation, as dean at that school, I'm always wondering, isn't there a more open and flexible way of education? Do you have any plans to share with Korean education institutions such as LTI Korea for more open sharing and exchange online, perhaps?
Is that for me or?
Maybe for Jürgen, Jakob, Becker, please.
Yes, we are open. So there is no cooperation yet, I must say. So let us say the scene of Korean of translators from Korean into German, there are not so many. And I personally know more Korean translators of German literature than from the other way around. But I think it is now the time to start something new. So we have some models like these vice versa workshops where we could share experiences and work together. I also agree with Chris what he said about Han Kang. I think this can be it was a success in Germany as well, and it is kind of a door opener for Korean literature. You always need some door openers, and Han Kang is maybe one of these opportunities. I think that the interest for Korean literature is rising. There has been, it was guest of honor at the Frankfurt Book Fair, but this is, I don't know, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. So it needs new initiatives. And to work on this translation process is, I think, a very good thing. And we are very open to start corporations. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I agree. I think from our point of view, we, through the UNESCO Cities of Literature Network, which Wonju and Bucheon are our wonderful sister cities of literature in Korea, and I was very pleased to visit Wonju 2 years ago and had an amazing visit, and to see both LTI Korea and Arts Council of Korea and to understand their passionate support was really fascinating. I think at the moment, we are commissioning 2 free online courses around literary translation that will explore both the practical and the professional elements of literary translation within the UK market. And we hope to have those online and available for everyone to have a look at in the spring of next year. We have a really excellent partnership with LTI Korea around exchange of translators and writers, and we are having some virtual writers in residence next year, assuming that COVID does let us do that. But we're very keen to explore the summer school online and to see how virtually we can carry on working together.
두 분 고마운 정말 한국.
Thank you very much for Korean literary translation. Those were sort of commitments that were very encouraging for our part. And I heard that you had already visited the sister cities, and I hadn't heard of that earlier. Since those two cities seem to have made a very good impression on you, perhaps we could expect to see you later in other cities as well. And in the keynote lecture, Professor Uchang said that translation is philosophically, it brings in curiosity and also intelligent thought. But I believe that translation is about sharing, it's about inclusion. And in particular, in difficult times such as these, it's quite meaningful that we are talking about sharing much, and I believe that it's more inclusive in that regard. And do you have any questions from your side? Do you have any questions from the presenter's side before we wrap up?
I would love to hear a little bit about the LTI Korea's plans and for your work as well. It sounds very exciting, your specialism in literary translation training, and to think about, what has been learned from your side over the last 7 months with COVID and how things have developed.
너무 긴 이야기가
That's going to be a very long story. At LTI Korea, our training programs, first of all, there's a lot of information that is on the online website of LTI Korea. And also, the Graduate School of Translation and Interpretation of Ewha also has a very strong website where you can see a lot of information, and we're preparing to do something online as well. And Mr. Becker, would you have any question for us?
Yes, I ask myself if LTI is organizing something like summer school for translators of Korean literature with participants from all over the world. This is something that we do, for example, for translators of German literature, to invite them to bring to a book fair and to make a workshop in this context and to inform about the new tendencies, new books in German. If there is a similar program in Korea.
사실 제가 KRTI 직원처럼
So to speak on behalf of LTI Korea, a translator's residency program is in place, but of course LTI Korea is about translating Korean literature into other languages. This is because, well, English literature and German literature is being translated very well by publishers, so training or other government support is not really required. Because in Korean publishing market, about 30% of the published literary works are from overseas. So Goethe or Shakespeare anthologies have been translated more than 30 times, and the most popular, most well-known works from writers in the English or French or Spanish or German languages, a lot of them, majority of them are already translated. So the LTI Korea is focusing on translators of Korean literature, and so we have a lot of programs to support that. And also, we are sending translators of Korean literature to overseas workshops in the UK and so on. Since we have a scheduled program, I think we will have to close this discussion session. I would like to thank you for joining us despite the time difference, the different time zones, and I hope that we'll be able to see you in person soon. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you. And Chris, I that everything you wrote was okay.
감사합니다. 최미경.
Thank you very much, Professor Choi, Mr. Chris Gribble, and Mr. Jürgen Jakob Becker. It's morning in Europe, we could see in the background. And the biggest challenge as of last year for literary translation was the advancement and emergence of machine translation. And this year, the biggest challenge is that we are not able to work face to face. And those two challenges were discussed in a very constructive way in that discussion session. So literary translation is not just a passive substitution of words, but it's a very creative, collaborative work, and we have more than 150 students online. And they are saying that it has been very helpful, and sometimes they are discouraged that AI might be better translators than themselves, but still they gained a lot of encouragement and stimulation from this discussion, and more flexible and open ways for cultural exchange based on translation. They have seen more encouragement to think of ideas to that end. So that's the end of the first session. And we would like to move on to the next session. The first presentation will be given by Professor Andrea de Benedittis, professor at University of Naples, L'Orientale, Italy. He will be speaking about the present and future of Korean literature in Italy in the era of COVID-19.
안녕하십니까. 코비드 시대의 이탈리아의 한국 문학 그 현재와 미래에 대해서 발표하도록 하겠습니다. 저는 나폴리 대학교에서 가르치는 안드레아 데 베네디티스라고 합니다. 반갑습니다. 저는 학생 시절부터 한국 문학에 관심을 가져왔고 2005년도부터 본격적으로 번역가로 활동하기 시작했습니다. 다양한 규모의 출판사와 프로젝트를 맡아서 진행하면서 여러 현대 작가를 번역할 귀중한 기회를 얻었습니다. 그 사이에 반갑게도 이탈리아 출판계가 한국 문학에 조심스럽게 눈을 뜨기 시작하는 것을 목격했습니다. 아울러 한국 문학에 대한 이탈리아 독자들의 인지도가 지속적으로 높아지는 것도 제 눈으로 지켜봤습니다. 물론 한류도 이 현상에 이바지한 요소 중 하나였겠지만 한국문학번역원이 수행한 역할은 그와 비길 수 없이 어마어마합니다. 소수 언어인 한국어에서 소수 언어인 이탈리아어로 책을 옮겨서 판매한다는 일 자체가 사업성이 매우 떨어지는 비낙관적이고 장래성 없는 일로 여겨진 적이 있었지만 한국문학번역원의 각종 지원 사업들이 이탈리아 국내 여러 출판인들에게 한국문학의 첫발을 디딜 수 있는 용기를 안겨줬습니다. 2020년의 물질적, 정신적 위기 속에서 역설적이게도 현재 이탈리아에서 진행되고 있는 한국문학 관련 프로젝트는 수적으로 봤을 때 사상 최다입니다. 여러 매체를 통해서 한국이 과거보다 더 많이 소개되고 있는 가운데 영화를 비롯한 다른 한국문학 콘텐츠들에 이어 한국문학도 널리 인정받기 시작하는 것입니다. 다련시를 추구하는 이탈리아 국내 독자들이 매체를 통해서 더 나은 현실로 미화되고 있는 한국을 회피를 위한 목적지로 설정하고 있는 것은 아닐까 하는 생각도 듭니다. 한의문학 번역 수요가 높아지는 만큼 차세대 번역가를 육성하는 일을 더욱 시급한 과제로 설정해야 될 것 같습니다. 아쉽게도 아직도 존역으로 옮겨지는 한국 작품이 종종 보입니다. 이탈리아 국내에서도 히트를 친 한강의 채식주의자와 정유정의 종의 기원을 존역의 대표적인 사례로 꼽을 수 있습니다. 일본과 중국 문학의 출판 시장에서는 더 이상 보이지 않는 현상이지만 이유는 뻔하다고 봅니다. 우선 아직까지도 한국 문학이 일본 문학의 인지도를 따라잡지 못한 것이 사실입니다. 일본 문학이 훨씬 앞서 이탈리아 도서 시장에 진출했기 때문입니다. 저절로 해결될 시간의 문제로 봅니다. 그리고 무엇보다도 이탈리아에서 활동하는 한국 문학 번역가 수가 극히 적다는 것과 이들이 상대적으로 인정받지 못하고 있다는 이유도 간과하면 안 됩니다. 출판사들이 이미 경력이 있는 번역가를 원하기 때문에 신진 번역가들은 데뷔할 기회를 찾기 어렵다는 악순환도 앞으로 풀어나가야 할 걸림돌입니다. 여기서 이탈리아 현재 출판 시장을 이해할 수 있는 몇 가지 간단한 지표를 제공하고자 합니다. 국가통계청에 의하면 작년 동기간에 대비하여 올해 7월에 이탈리아 도서시장이 6억 유로에서 5.3억 유로로 11% 축소되었습니다. 봉쇄령이 실시된 시기에는 마이너스 20%를 기록하기도 했으며 당시 도서를 출시가 모두 중지, 연기되면서 모든 서점들의 매출이 한꺼번에 적자로 돌아섰습니다. 어린이 책과 청소년 책만 큰 타격을 피할 수 있었습니다. 작년 7월에 서거한 최고의 인기 조리 작가인 가밀레리의 4호 작품이 나온 6월부터는 출판계의 회복 신호가 보이기 시작했고 2.5%에 불과하긴 하지만 9월부터는 오히려 성장 추세가 기록되었습니다. 도서전을 비롯한 홍보 활동이 아예 마비 상태인 것과 수요가 바닥을 치고 있는 관광 안내서와 박물관 도록도 포함되어 있다는 것을 고려하면 출판계가 입은 타격이 우려보다는 덜 심각한 셈입니다. 이목을 끌만한 또 다른 현상은 코로나 이전의 유통망에 오직 27%만 차지했던 온라인 서점들이 근래에 들어 시장을 독점하다시피 하며 48% 정도를 차지하게 되었다는 것입니다. 독자들이 온라인으로 책을 구매하기만 하는 것이 아니라 구매할 책 선택도 온라인에서 하는 경향도 더욱 강해졌습니다. 이제 온라인 SNS 마케팅이 출판업의 성공에서 결정적인 역할을 맡게 된 것입니다. 전자책의 소비도 점점 일반화되는 가운데 이제 소설책의 44%가 전자버전과 같이 출간되고 있습니다. 이처럼 코로나19라는 유례없는 범지구적 재난은 도서 시장에도 어느 정도 영향을 끼쳤고 도서 시장의 디지털화를 가속화하는 결과를 가져왔습니다. 이 같은 현상은 교육에도 반영되고 있습니다. 한국문학번역원이 지원하는 해외 한국학대학 번역 실습 프로그램을 저희 나폴리 오리엔탈레 대학교에서 맡아서 진행한 지가 이제 3년 차입니다. 매년 그랬던 것처럼 봄학기 기간과 맞추어서 3월부터 5월까지 진행하는 것이 계획이었는데 우연치 않게 이탈리아 봉쇄 기간과 정확히 겹치게 되었습니다. 안전상 문제로 모든 강의들은 즉시 비대면 형태로 전환되었고 번역 실습 프로그램도 마찬가지였습니다. 새로운 환경에 다급하게 적응하느라 저와 학생들 모두 정신없는 나날을 보냈습니다. 이 자리를 빌어 본대학에서 지난 학기에 진행했던 번역 실습 수업의 연태, 내용 구성, 보완점과 지향점 등에 대해서 간략하게나마 말씀드리고자 합니다. 먼저 번역 실습을 위한 작품으로 황석영의 개바라기별 선정했습니다. 한국어를 모국어를 하지 않는 독자가 이 글의 문체를 이해하기가 쉽지가 않습니다만은 현 한국 문학계의 거두가 보여주는 한국 문학의 진정한 매력을 느낄 수 있다고 생각합니다. 번역 실습 과정은 다음과 같이 구성되었습니다. 우선 작가와 작품 소개를 했고요. 그리고 원문 이해하기, 교수 지도하에 해석하기, 수강자가 스스로 번역해 보기라는 단계를 밟았고요. 그리고 번역 유문 한 다음에 다시 저랑 같이 학생들이 그 텍스트를 감수했고요. 그리고 네 번째로 출판사에 넘기기 전에 출판사 규정에 맞게 교정 과정을 밟았습니다. 그리고 아직도 이루어지지 않았지만 다음 단계는 작가와 만남 행사가 있고 그리고 마지막으로 제가 모든 텍스트를 다시 확인하면서 학생들 중에서 누가 제일 잘했는지 보고 베스트 번역가를 선정할 단계가 남아 있습니다. 번역 실습 수업은 일반 교양 수업이 아닌 별도의 선수 세미나 과목으로 정했고 과정을 성공적으로 이수한 수강생은 2학점을 취득했습니다. 최대 수강 신청 가능 인원은 20명으로 성적이 높은 3학년과 석사 과정 학생들에게 수강 자격을 우선적으로 부여했습니다. 실시간으로 접속하고 수강하는 실시간 참가 영상 강의와 사전 녹화식 영상 강의 두 가지의 수업 진행 방식을 모두 채택했습니다. 두 가지 방식 모두 장단점이 있는데요. 먼저 실시간 참가 수업의 경우 학생들의 반응을 바로 확인할 수 있고 수업 진행이 덜 기계적이며 흥미를 보다 자극하며 지루함도 적었습니다. 그 대신 생각보다 자주 발생하는 학생들의 접속 문제로 인해서 진행이 순조롭지 못할 때가 있었습니다. 반면에 녹화식으로 수업을 진행하면 제작한 자료를 차후에 다른 학생들을 위해서 다시 재사용할 수 있어 실현성이 높지만 수강생들의 강의 내용을 체계적으로 습득하는지 전혀 관찰할 수 없다는 단점이 있었습니다. 이번 세미나 경험을 토대로 봤을 때 강의 소개, 작가 소개, 번역학개론 등을 비롯한 이론적인 내용을 사전 녹화식 강의로 전달하되 실제 번역 실습을 실시 참가식 강의로 진행하는 것이 바람직하다고 판단됩니다. 바로바로 학생들의 번역문을 수정하고 수업의 흐름에 따라 즉흥적인 충고를 제공할 수 있어서 수업이 훨씬 자연스러웠습니다. 원래 계획에는 외부 전문가를 초청하는 특강도 3차례 포함되어 있었는데 팬데믹 사태에 불구하고 그대로 개최하되 원격식으로 진행되었습니다. 이번 세미나에 초대한 3분의 전문가를 소개하겠습니다. 순서대로 주제피나 드 니콜 한국문학 전문가이시고요. 그리고 일라리아 베니니 출판사의 편집자고요. 그리고 마지막으로 한국 근현대사 전문가이신 한종철 교수를 초대했습니다. 이러한 특강의 목적은 학생들이 작가의 문학세계와 작품에 대해 보다 잘 이해하고 번역가란 직업을 구체적으로 경험할 수 있게 하는 것입니다. 학생들의 참여가 매우 적극적이고 수업을 수강하면서 컴퓨터로 바로 번역 실습을 할 수 있기 때문에 교실에서보다 강의 시간을 효율적으로 활용할 수 있었습니다. 그리고 앞으로도 번역 실습을 온라인으로 진행하게 된다면 지리적 한계를 넘어 어느 특정 학교 학생들에 한정하지 않고 다 지역과 다 대학의 학생들도 참여시켜 국내 우수 학생들을 대상으로 하는 특수 과정으로 재편할 수 있으리라 기대됩니다. 6월에 실시한 학내 설문조사에 의하면 이번 학기 강의에 대한 학생들의 만족도는 떨어지지 않았습니다. 오히려 재택 수업에 대한 긍정적인 반응이 보였습니다. 따라서 이번 경험을 좋은 기회로 삼아서 앞으로 비대면 강의의 모든 가능성과 잠재성을 더 연구한다면 한국학 교육을 더욱 효율적인 방향으로 발전시킬 수 있으리라 확신합니다. 마지막으로 현재 프로그램을 보완한다면 문학 변론에 대한 강의를 포함시킬 수 있을 것입니다. 현재로서는 이탈리아 출판인과 독자들에게 한국 문학에 대한 이해도를 높여줄 수 있는 전문 평론가가 부재하다고 할 수 있습니다. 신진 번역가를 발굴하는 일도 시급하지만 한국 문학 전공자로서 한국 문학의 가치를 깊이 이해하고 비평하는 전문가도 필요합니다. 동시에 이탈리아 도서 시장을 잘 파악하고 현재 취향에 맞게 작품을 섭외하는 스카우터, 인재, 발굴 작업도 반드시 필요합니다. 단순화해서 말하자면 현재 이탈리아의 한국문화 출판계는 아직 아마추어적인 면을 벗어나지 못했습니다. 이 팬데믹이 우연하게 준 모든 기회를 이용하여 한 발 더 빠르게 이런 여백을 배워야 한다고 생각합니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다. 안드레아.
Thank you very much. Professor Andrea de Benedittis, he is very fluent in Korean, as you have seen. So the status of the publishing market in Italy and also the very realistic stories that he has as a translator and trainer of translators in Italy. And I particularly remember the part about the importance of literary critics as well as translators. I always tell my students that the first step and the most important step in literary criticism is translation, and that is not going to be replaced by machines. So the next presentation will be given by Professor Yoon Sun-mi. She will be speaking on good instructors and good translation.
안녕하세요. 한국문학번역원 번역 아카데미 스페인어권 지도교수 윤선미라고 합니다. 예, 제 발표문의 주제는 좋은 교수자와 좋은 번역입니다. 이 발표문을 준비하기 위해서 제가 좀 번역 이론 자료를 봤는데 그 좋은 이런 트랜슬레이션 컴peten스 모델이라고 이게 뭐냐면 빡드라는 그 번역을 연구하는 그룹이더라고요. 이게 바르셀로나 자치대학의 통번역 학부에 기반한 그런 번역 능력과 과정을 연구하는 그룹 빡드인데요. 여기서 이 연구소에서 번역가가 갖춰야 될 자질과 능력을 6가지를 제시했어요. 도표로 보실 수 있죠. 지금 시간 부족해서 다 다루지 않을 거고요. 그 받으신 자료집에 아마 출처가 나올 겁니다. 저는 오늘 여기 여러 능력 중에 6가지 능력 중에서 저는 이중 언어 능력과 그리고 knowledge about translation, 그러니까 번역 능력에 대해서 좀 논하겠습니다. 예, 이 시간이 있으시면 이게 이 아티클이 PDF 파일로 인터넷에서 볼 수 있기 때문에 누구나 찾아볼 수 있기 때문에 번역가들이 자기가 어떤 능력을 강화하고 또 발전시켜야 되는 스스로 이제 확인할 수 있는 그런 아티클입니다. 한번 참고해 보세요. 그리고 또 기관 입장에서 문학 번역 교육에 필요한 교육 과정을 만들 때도 활용할 수 있다고 봅니다. 제 논문은 아까 말했듯이 이중 언어 능력에 대해서 논하고요. 그리고 번역 능력에 대해서. 이중 언어 능력은 말 그대로 우리 번역할 때는 두 언어, 그러니까 출발어와 도착어에 능숙해야 된다는 거죠. 그게 제일 이제 번역가에 갖춰야 될 자질인데 이게 사실 균형 있게 갖추기가 힘들죠. 그래서 이것을 이제 번역 실습 수업 그리고 다른 한국어 및 문학 수업을 실태 통해서 논할 겁니다. 2부에서는 번역 능력, 번역이 무엇인가에 대해서 한번 고민하겠습니다. 그리고 새로운 개념을 소개하겠습니다. 탈언어화라는 개념. 우리 번역 실습 수업 실태는 그러니까 저희들 이제 어떤 과정에 따라서 정규 과정의 경우는 그 학생들이 대부분 외국인 학생들이에요. 이 학생들은 당연히 이 이중 언어 중에서 한국어가 제일 부족하죠. 근데 이제 특별 과정 학생들은 대부분 내국인 학생들이에요. 이 학생들은 도착 언어인 외국어가 부족합니다. 당연하죠. 그래서 우리 수업 시간에 한 80%가 이 언어적 문제를 해결하는데 할애하게 돼요. 외국인 학생들한테는 원문을 설명하고 이해시키는데 시간이 많이 들어가고요. 그리고 한국인 학생들한테는 학생들은 원문을 이해하는데 전혀 문제 없지만 그것을 이제 스페인어로 도착 언어로 이제 표현할 때 이제 범하는 이제 오류들, 문장 구조나 뭐 문법적 오류들 그런 거 이제 고치다 보면 시간이 다 갑니다. 그래서 저는 문학적 분석에 충분히 시간을 할애할 수가 없어서 좀 안타까워요. 문학적인 분석은 왜 중요하냐면 그 작품을 충분히 문학적으로 이해해야만 좋은 번역이 나온다고 생각하거든요. 또 번역의 완성대 큰 비중을 차지하고 있는 문체를 충분히 다듬을 시간이 부족해요. 이 번역이 끝난 다음에 이것을 다듬는 과정이 사실 한 번도 아니고 한 2-3번 거쳐서 다듬어야 좋은 번역물이 나올 수 있는데 이 다듬을 시간이 터무니없이 부족합니다. 그리고 또 이 실습 수업에 좀 시간이 부족한 이유가 또 어떤 영향을 미치냐면 번역 실습 대상 그 작품 선정할 때도 영향을 미치는 게 우리 제일 먼저 그 작품의 길이를 생각하게 돼요. 그러니까 우리 수업 12주 수업인데 그 12주 동안 다루려면 한 25페이지 초과하면 좀 힘들어요. 30페이지는 아예 불가능하고요. 그래서 작품을 선정할 때 제일 먼저 길이를 이제 고려해야 된다는 게 좀 안타깝죠. 해결 방안은 저는 현재 한 학기가 12주 강의로 구성되어 있는데 15주로 연장하면 어떨까? 왜냐하면 번역 수업들이 이 번역 과정에서 제일 메인인데 조금 더 길게 가면 좀 문체도 다듬을 시간 있고 또 문학적인 그런 분석도 좀 할 수 있는 시간이 있지 않을까 싶어요. 그리고 문학 비평가의 강연도 좀 들었으면 해요. 그 문학적 그 분석을 좀 전문적으로 해주실 분. 왜냐하면 작품을 제대로 문학적으로 이해해야만 좋은 번역이 나온다고 생각합니다. 지금 작가와의 공동 번역 시간이 있지만 작가님이 해결해 주실 문제는 왜 어떤 어휘를 썼다, 어떤 의도로 썼다 그 정도지만 스스로 당신의 작품을 분석하지는 못하시거든요, 작가님들이. 다른 수업들, 한국어 및 문학 수업 쉴 때는 사실은 이 수업들은 외국인 학생들이 들어요. 그러니까 정규과정 학생들이 듣는 수업인데 사실 이 학생들이 제가 맡은 정규과정 학생들이 1학년인데 특히 1학년 첫 학기에는 많이 힘들어합니다. 한국의 이제 생활에 적응하는데도 힘든데 그 중에서 대부분 수업들이 다 좋지만 그 중에서 하나, 두 개가 좀 따라가기가 힘들면 학생들이 많이 좌절하거든요. 그래서 학생들이 저희 수업 시간에 사실 말이 통하고 우리 언어권 몇 명 안 되니까 이제 자기네들끼리 얘기하는 거 또 저한테도 이제 하소연하는 그런 내용 바탕으로 썼습니다. 학생들이 어떤 불만을 갖고 있냐면 수업이 느슨하고 요점이 알 수 없다. 수업의 내용을 따라가기가 힘들다. 특별히 교수의 말씀이 너무 빠르고 어려운 단어들을 사용한다. 또 주시는 과제로 읽을 거리나 과제가 너무 어렵고 그리고 무엇보다도 분량이 너무 많다. 예를 들어서 다음 시간까지 단편 하나 읽어와라. 근데 학생들은 그건 물리적으로 불가능합니다. 일일이 다 단어들 다 찾아야 되고 그거를 또 문장들도 다 이해해야 되고 일주일 그것만 한다고 해도 다 못할 겁니다. 그리고 제출한 과제에 대한 피드백이 없다는 것도 아주 큰 불만입니다. 과제는 제출했는데 선생님이 코멘트조차 안 해주신다. 그래서 이 해결 방안들은 제가 생각하기보다는 학생들이 저한테 수업을 이렇게 진행됐으면 좋겠다 하는 내용이거든요. 수업은 처음부터 끝까지 철저한 준비하에 진행됐으면 좋겠다. 수업 내용은 그러기 위해서는 PPT로 정리해서 선생님이 학생들에게 제공하면 학생들이 따라가기가 더 쉬울 거고 그리고 또 교수님의 그 강의 내용도 훨씬 더 정리가 잘 되겠죠. 그리고 너무 추상적이고 이런적인 내용보다 좀 실용적이고 그런 내용이 팩트에 바탕 둔 내용들이 학생들이 좀 이해하기가 쉽죠. 그리고 다양한 관점들을 보여주는 이해를 충분히 제시하면 좋을 것 같아요. 그러니까 거기 이해에 뭐가 들어가냐면 영상물, 도표, 사진, 그냥 이해. 또 말씀도 천천히 해주시고 반복적으로 해주시고 이해를 많이 제시하시면서 설명해 주시면 학생들이 훨씬 편하겠죠. 알아듣기가. 그리고 수업 교재는 구체적이고 아주 효율적이어야 되고 그리고 분량도 적합해야 된다고 봅니다. 그러니까 단편 하나 전체는 학생들은 학생들은 읽을 수 없으니까 예를 들어서 딱 적합한 양이 뭐냐면 한 2페이지에서 A4 용지 2페이지에서 5페이지 정도 그런 거. 그러니까 그런 과제를 그런 읽을 거리를 주시려면 먼저 교수님이 이거를 다 편집에 정리해서 주셔야 된다는 거죠. 그리고 학생들이 이제 제출한 그 연습 문제나 과제를 꼭 수업 시간에 코멘트 해주시거나 아니면 고쳐서 수정해서 돌려주셔야 학생들이 어떤 에러를 범했는지 어떤 실수를 했는지 알고 고칠 수가 있죠. 예, 저는 사실 이 부분이 이제 마지막 부분이고 이게 우리 번역이 무엇인지에 대해서 좀 고민하자고 이 탈언어라는 새 개념을 소개하겠습니다. 이거 제가 만든 개념이 아니라, 근데 제가 평상시에 생각했던 것이 이게 이 그룹 번역을 연구하는 그룹에서 이렇게 멋진 단어로 어렵게 느껴지지만 이제 설명하면 충분히 이해가 되실 겁니다. 우리 평상시에 번역 과정이 아마 2단계로 이루어진다고 생각하실 거예요. 일반적으로 저도 이게 뭐냐면 원문을 이해하고 그리고 그것을 이제 도착 언어로 옮기는 것, 그 2 작업으로 이루어진다고 생각하는데 이 번역 전문가들은 이 중간 단계를 하나 넣습니다. 이게 탈언어 단계. 이게 중요한 게 뭐냐면 탈언어가 뭐냐면 원문을 이해해서 그거에 대한 이미지나 개념을 구축한다는 거예요. 그러기 위해서는 원문의 언어적 껍데기를 완전히 벗겨서 그 안에 있는 의미만, 내용, 의도를 그걸 추출해서 그것을 번역한다는 거예요. 그래서 이 단어의 이 개념에 나오듯이 뭐냐면 탈언어와는 언어적 간섭에서 완전히 벗어나는 거죠. 그러니까 우리는 이거를 기억해야 되는 거예요. 번역할 때 우리가 언어를 문장 구조를 옮기고 있는 게 아니라 우리는 이미지, 개념, 의도, 내용 그것을 번역하고 있다는 것을 상기시켜주는 개념입니다. 근데 탈언어화를 거치지 않은 번역하면 어떤 번역이 나올까요? 그러니까 우리 그냥 원문만 이해하고 아무 생각 없이 번역을 옮기면 어떻게 되냐면 직역을 하게 되죠. 번역기처럼 1:1 대응으로 번역하게 돼요. 그러니까 단어 대 단어, 문장 대 문장. 근데 이거 언어에 얽매여서 원문 텍스트의 의무뿐만 아니라 문장 구조까지 우리가 무의식적으로 옮기다 보면 어떤 일이 벌어지냐면 문장 단위로 번역하게 돼요. 단어 단위로 문장 단위로 번역하니까 번역물의 문장들이 논리적, 유기적으로 잘 이어지지 않고 따로따로 나온다는 거죠. 그러면 당연히 가독성과 번역의 질이 떨어지죠. 해결 방안은 탈언어화를 의식하고 지속적으로 훈련한다는 거죠. 이게 가능합니다. 원문의 언어적 지배에서 벗어나 옮길 때는 도착 언어로 생각하면서 문장들을 만들어야 된다. 그리고 불필요한 것은 버리고 필요한 것은 더할 줄 아는 탄력적인 태도를 가져야 된다. 그러니까 원문의 한국어는 너무 좀 반복적이기도 하고 또 문장들이 너무 간결하죠. 그대로 옮기면 안 된다는 거죠. 필요하면 문장들 이어줄 줄도 알고 반복적인 건 뺄 줄도 알고 그런 탄력적인 번역 태도가 필요하다는 거고요. 그리고 번역에 대한 풀 컨트롤을 가져야 된다는 거. 그러니까 번역은 내 번역이긴 하지만 원작의 바탕을 두고 있는 번역이긴 하지만 또 새로운 작품이라는 것을 그걸 잊지 말고 내 번역에 대한 풀 컨트롤, 풀 마인드, 풀 의식을 갖고 해야 된다는 겁니다. 죄송합니다. 그리고 마지막은 검토하는 작업인데요. 검토하는 작업, 번역 바로 끝나고 검토 들어가면 그런 원문이 아직도 머릿속에 너무 생생해서 아무 문제 없는 것 같아요. 번역이 잘 돼 있는 것 같아요. 근데 시간적 간격을 두고 일주일이든 한 달 많은 시간 길어질수록 좋아요. 지나서 다시 읽으면 이제 원문에 대한 그 지배에서 벗어난 상태에서 읽으면 그때 가서 이제 보이기 시작해요. 얼마나 문장이 자연스러운지 아니면 비자연스러운지. 그래서 그래서 이 탈언어라는 것을 좀 더 구체적으로 우리가 의식하고 연습하면 이런 좋은 문제점들을 해결할 수도 있고 좋은 번역이 나올 거라고 믿습니다. 네, 여기까지 경청해 주셔서 감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yoon. LTI Korea is running the Literary Translation Academy, and as Ms. Yoon is teaching in that course, she told us about what has to be improved and what has to be in place to on a more practical level, and also about bilingual competence and deverbalization were major points of her presentation. And we had a question earlier about the Translation Academy at LTI Korea. In 2003, I believe the short-term training program began, and in 2008, it was expanded to the Translation Academy, and now we have regular course and intensive course and atelier across 7 languages, comprising more than 1,000 graduates as of now. So we have heard the presentations for session 2. Now we will have the discussion. This discussion will be given by Professor Jung Ki-in from Seoul National University of Science and Technology. And Professor Benedittis is joining us through Zoom. And the literary translator, Ms. Yoon, has thankfully enough been able to join us here in this hall. So now I will hand over the microphone to Professor Chung.
Good evening. I am Kim Chung. I'm from the Seoul National University of Science and Technology. I would like to first of all say how much I enjoyed the presentations by the two speakers. It was a great opportunity for me to learn about translation of Korean literature in Italy and also about education taking place both in Korea and Italy. So due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a lot of changes. So my role today is to start the conversation started on literature translation training, specifically on its content and future direction, as well as the future of translation education in this era. To just briefly introduce myself, I have taught classes in literary translations, and I also taught at the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. And at the time, I taught translation involving Korean works translated into Japanese. And also, before I completed my doctoral dissertation, I participated in translation workshop at SNU UBC program. And at the time, LTI Korea supported this endeavor. I also lived in Costa Rica, United States, and Japan for about 8 years. So I have been translating a lot during those times, and I have actually translated English texts into Korean, and 8 of them have been published. And also, I write both in Japanese and in English as well. So I am constantly facing the challenges of translation. So I completely agree with many things that the two speakers said. So I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Andrea de Benedittis. I enjoyed your presentation very much. And I have followed the news about the pandemic situation in Italy, and you have provided some statistics on how the outbreak is, progressing in Italy. That was very helpful, but you have not provided any clear numbers regarding the Korean wave, the Hallyu. For example, what is the level of Italian public's awareness of Korean literature, the number of Korean literature projects currently underway in Italy, and the number of Korean literary translators based in Italy. I think these figures might be very interesting for me to hear about. And you mentioned that Japanese literature has broader recognition in Italy compared to Korean literature. And you said that this issue is a matter of time that will be resolved on its own. So I'm curious as to your reasoning behind this claim. And I would also like to hear about more details on the sales of Korean literature in the Italian market. And also, I would like to know more about the Korean literature classes being offered at the University of Naples. What does the curriculum look like, and what status do translation courses enjoy within that framework? And are the classes offered by class year, or courses on translation practice usually taken after some other prior prerequisite courses?
질문 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for your questions.
사실은 제가 이 발표를 준비하면서
So while I was
여러 가지
preparing for this
데이터를
presentation,
따로 준비를 하고 싶었는데
I really
그리고
wanted to
제공을
provide
해드리고
more
싶었습니다.
notes
그렇지만 많은 데이터들을
and
오직
more
출판사
data,
안에서만 가지고 있기 때문에
but some of the data
한계가 조금
was
있었습니다.
only limited
꼭
to
문학이 아니더라도
a certain
한국
publishing house, so I wasn't able to share the data
완벽하지
within
않은
my
것들에 대한 사랑,
manuscript.
희민 스님의 책이 비교적으로 많이 팔렸다고
The
들었고
Buddhist monk
그리고 그것보다
Hemin's essay
한강의
has been quite
제식주의자의 판매량이
popular.
제일 좋았다고 들었습니다.
And I heard that
확실한
the
얘기가
sales of the
아니지만은
vegetarian from Hangang were highest in Italy among Korean literary works. And I'm not quite sure about this, but anyway, what I heard from a person from the publishing industry was that the year that vegetarian came out, it exceeded 10,000 copies of sales.
성공 케이스로 생각하면
So
어떨까
I think
싶습니다.
it could be
그리고 신경숙의
seen as the most
엄마를
successful
부탁해도 이탈리아어
work of Korean
판이
literature in Korea.
나왔는데요.
And
우리가
please
우리가
look after
기대한
Mom
만큼
of Shin Kyung-suk is
잘
also
팔리지 않았다고
published in
생각합니다.
Italy, but it wasn't,
당연히
the sales
이제
weren't up to
그 작품을
expectations.
사랑하는
Of course,
독자들이 많지만은
there were many readers who enjoyed
저와
reading the book
그리고
and loved it very
출판인들이
much,
기대했던
but
만큼 그게
the
잘
sales
뜨지
weren't
않았다고
up to the expectations of
생각합니다.
myself or the
그리고
publishing
올해는 내년에
industry.
82년생 김지영님이
And next year we are
출간이 된다고
going to
들었는데
publish
아마 이 작품에 대한
the
기대를
Kim Ji-young,
조금
born in
해보시지 않을까
1982.
생각이
And I
듭니다.
think we
네.
can look forward to
일단은,
very strong sales for that
예.
book as well.
그리고 이탈리아에서 활동하는 한국 문학 번역가의
And translators of Korean literature within who are located in Italy, I believe that it's going to be a very small number because
한국어 이탈리아어 번역 수요가
there
적었다는
hasn't been
거예요.
much demand
현재 저를
of
포함해서
translation
한
from
5명,
Korean literature works
6명
into
정도
Italy. I think it's around
거고요.
5 to 6 people,
한국만
including myself.
고전 문학을 전문적으로
And
번역을
one
하시고
person
나머지는
focuses
거의
exclusively on
현대사,
classical Korean literature, and the
현대
rest
문학을 위주로
translate
번역을 많이
mostly
하는 걸로 알고
contemporary
있습니다.
Korean works.
최근에 한 번역가가 한국
More recently, one translator has published
아마 이탈리아에서
an
처음으로
anthology of
근대 문학이
Korean
발표된 사례로
Korean
꼽혀질 수 있을 거라고
modern
생각합니다.
short stories, and I think it's going to be the very first occasion within Italy. And one of my own students, who is Italian,
대학원으로 진학해서
has
한국에서
gone
이제
to graduate school in Korea.
과라든가 이제 다니고 있는 학생들이 좀 많아지고 있는데
And actually, we're seeing a growing number of students who are studying Korean literature or translation in graduate schools in Korea. So we are expecting them to be quite active in literary translation soon. So up to now, we have around 6 active translators of Korean literature in Italy, but we're looking forward to a growth in that number because students are preparing. And there was a question about Japanese literature. I asked a friend who's a scholar of Japanese studies, in a year, how many Japanese works of literature are translated into Italian? And my friend told me that it's more than 30. More than 30 Japanese literary works are translated into Italian and published. Korean literary works amount to about 2 or 3 a year, so it's very hard to compete or compare with Japanese works. But currently, many projects are underway, so next year, I think about 5 to 6 Korean literary works are going to be translated and published in Italy. So we see that there's an upward trend, and if this trend goes on, we will be able to reduce the gap or catch up very significantly with Japanese literature within the Italian market. And about Hallyu, or the Korean wave, so as you may well know, the Korean wave is raging across Italy, and so Korean cultural content is very popular. K-pop, Korean TV dramas, Korean movies are mesmerizing, especially the younger generation. I think it's similar to the craze about Japanese anime and games. So I hope that this is going to be a good opportunity for those who are interested in Korean popular culture to find more interest in other cultural content, including Korean literature. So readers of Korean literature had been reading Korean literature because of its exotic allure, not because they were interested in Korean culture, but I think that might change going forward. And in terms of activity, there is a lot of events taking place regarding Korean culture and literature. So I translate Baesu as the unknown night and day of a day, and there's going to be a book cafe or a book event very soon. And we see that there are Instagram pages and web pages that deal with Korean literature. And we see a lot of Korean literature content that is being uploaded on social media and the internet as well. So I'm sorry that I'm not able to share very accurate data, but if we take all of these information into account, then I think it can be seen as a signal of a larger awareness, a bigger awareness of Korean literature. And I think we can also consider this as well, because we're seeing more exchange in terms of people and in terms of culture between Italy and Korea. The publishers and agents are really putting in a lot of efforts to promote Korean literature, and I think that should also be taken into account. And one data point that I can share with you that I'm quite sure of is that we are seeing an increase rate about 30% of the students who are enrolling in the program at my school. So I think it's probably due to the increase in the readership of Korean literature as well. And there was also a question about the University of Naples, and I think I could answer that as follows. So I heard that the Korean Studies Department was first established in Europe at the University of Naples. And though 60 years have passed since then, we haven't seen much development in Korean studies in Europe. And so one of the full-time professors has recently retired, so we're going to undergo some organizational changes. And one problem is that we have a growing number of students, but the number of professors are still the same. And so we have a lot of work to do in terms of curriculum and also the staffing. And still, there are so many new students who are choosing Korean language as their major. And for example, we had around 180 students who chose Korean language as their major as freshmen this year. And so I believe that we have a lot of potential going forward for Korean studies here. So I hope that you'll continue to support us. And we have only 2 courses on Korean literature. It's not an elective. It's not elective. It's not a elective course. It's a required mandatory course. but it focuses more on modern and contemporary literature rather than classical literature, and it is taught by a non-full-time instructor, not myself. But aside from those courses, we have a lot of events and activities that are in place, much of which is supported by LTI Korea. Every year, we, for example, invite a writer from Korea to join in many events. And up to now, we have seen very enthusiastic response from the students. 장경숙, 배수아, most recently 배수아 and Kim Bong-gon was invited so they could meet and converse with the students.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much for your answer. I would very much like to, spend a full hour with you to ask more questions, but in the interest of time, I will have to save those questions for our plenary discussion later on. I actually lived in Japan, and I realized that it takes time, and these evolution of translation often need to be faced. And Kim Ji-young, born 1982, did quite well in other markets. So I think there have been new books which feature, overview of Korean literature. And I think Italy could be one of those markets where translation of Korean literature can really take off. When I taught at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, the students come in and say, they're fans of BTS and other pop idols. And then after several years, they learn to enjoy the more classical works of Korean poets and other writers. So if you think about it, K-pop songs are very lyrical, and there's also some poetic elements in it. So they start with that, and then they learn to enjoy Korean literature in a broader sense. So now I'd like to talk to or ask a question to Ms. Sunmi Yoon. So you've been teaching at the LTI's Translation Academy, and I was curious about the Korean proficiency of the students there. You did mention that the students of regular courses are mostly foreign nationals whose proficiency in the Korean language is lacking. So to what extent was this proficiency lacking? I mean, these students have actually come in order to learn, to translate. So what are some motivations for these students to come and take your courses in the LTI's academy? And another question is about the differences in translation of poetry, fiction, and film. And I have majored in poetry, so I often translate poetry. And oftentimes it takes a lot of time just to translate one poem. And it takes a lot more time than just reading poems. And the students in Tokyo, the students that I taught, when I gave them assignment to translate poems, oftentimes they would spend a lot more time reading in-depth the poems, sometimes even more in-depth than the Korean readers. So I actually recommend translating in order to have this in-depth reading. But it seems that the two of you are more focused on teaching translation of fictions. I think there may be differences in our methodologies when it comes to translating different types of text. So when I'm translating poems, there's a line in a poem by Yoon Dong-ju. It says, "To hold not a single spot of shame before the skies till my dying days." And we could spend hours discussing just this single line. And there is, for example, the word sky. And we would talk hours about how that word sky would be translated into a Japanese alternative. And also we would talk about the historical background, and we would also talk about how the target text should be phrased in order to deliver the right kind of nuance. And we would talk about the word choice of the poems. And, these words, the single spot, the word little and the word none. And we would come up with different candidates in the target text in order to consider which would be the best fit. But if we were to take this approach in translating novels, we would take an entire lifetime to translate a single short story. So I'd like to understand the difference between translating fiction versus poems. Have you also taught translation of other forms of text, such as lyrics of songs or films? And another question is related to the question I asked to Ms. Yoon. I think the translation course content will have to be quite different depending on the proficiency of the Korean proficiency of the students. When I taught at the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies and at UBC, these students were very proficient in Korean. And perhaps in Tokyo, because the similarities between the two languages, they were more able to follow with the courses that I'm teaching. And sometimes some of the students that I was teaching in Tokyo, when they spoke Korean, they almost sounded native. And so they were able to capture these nuances in the Korean language. But teaching them and teaching students who are less proficient in Korean might be very different, and that might have different outcomes when it comes to the pedagogical approach and the instructional design. So I'd like to talk about that as well. And also, the difference between focusing on literature versus focusing on the translation. So I think Mr. Benedittis seems to be sort of in the middle. And Ms. Yoon is more focused on the translation versus literature when you're teaching the courses. And so I think, these approaches might be different. So when you're teaching, which of these two do you place more weight, and why? Have you made that choice? And if you were to take the other choice, how would that change your course teaching and instruction? And also, in my courses, I have paired up Korean students with a foreign student, and oftentimes it would be a group of 4, and they would talk about their translations, and they would come up with a best translation from that group. And maybe this was possible because we would have short poems to work on. So each one would translate, their version, and then they would come and discuss the choice of suffix and words and whatnot. And so there would be 3 foreign students paired up with 1 Korean student would often be an optimal mix. So I think this model might work in other settings as well. And also, since we're doing a lot of the teaching virtually, maybe this actually makes it more easier to conduct these types of pairing up of students of different mother tongues to come together. And with the support of LTI Korea Academy, there was this workshop where I have participated with international translators and students, and I had very good memories. So I think maybe we could have some matching programs where the Korean aspiring translators and foreign nationals who are translating could work together. And I think this kind of collaboration would be very fruitful. So I'd like to hear your feedback on that. So I've asked so many questions, but maybe Ms. Yoon could respond to some of them. So you can hear me well, right? Well, based on my presentation, you gathered that there are students who are from other countries who are very, less proficient in Korean language, but that is actually the case. And when we admit students, we not only look at their proficiency of the Korean language, but they also look at their writing skills. And there are some variations when it comes to the students coming from different language backgrounds. And the Spanish students have a grade 4 to 5 in TOPIK's test, which assesses Korean proficiency. And oftentimes, these students had never really read a full volume of Korean literature in the Korean language, in the original text. Often these students would have read translations of Korean literature, but not the original text, and they got interested. And it's true that they are less proficient in Korean language, but that in and of itself is not an obstruction or an obstacle. I think it's very important that they be proficient and skilled in writing in their mother tongue, or what would be the target language. And so, as Koreans, oftentimes we would learn a foreign language, but we would be able to understand that, but we would not be able to reach a level where we would be proficient in writing in the foreign language. But these students are able to write better in their target language. And I also brought up the concept of deverbalization. And of course, you have to have some proficiency in order to understand the original text, but you have to deverbalize and you have to distance yourself from the original text. And although lower proficiency in the Korean language can be a hurdle, but it's not something that can't be overcome. And I think it's very important to design our instruction so that it really is aligned with the level of proficiency of the foreign students. I think that was what I wanted to emphasize, rather than the fact that these students were less proficient in the Korean language. And usually we would take one short story and try to translate this over the course of a semester. And we also do some polishing of the writing styles. And in that course, I tried translation of poetry with students. Students did not seem to think translating poems were more difficult than the prose. And when we were translating poems, they felt that they could exercise more creativity and their unique personalities, and the students really enjoyed the process. I think translation of poetry and fiction, I think the approach is quite similar. First, you have to understand from a literary standpoint, and that's an important thing that I emphasize all the time. You asked whether I focused on language or literature or the translation. Well, we have to catch all of those three rabbits. Of course, the ultimate goal is to translate into a target language, but of course, you have to have a very clear literary understanding of the work itself in order to deliver a very good translation. And of course, you would have to have a sound linguistic skills and base. But of course, this would be a tool, rather, it would be a means rather than the aim. But I think for me, the most important thing would be to nurture one's ability to really critically understand the literary text. So when we admit students, we really look for students who read a lot, not just the Korean literature, but their own literature. Thank you very much for those responses. I do want to spend another hour with you as well, asking questions. And with regards to question number three, so Ms. Yoon was saying that we have to focus on all of those. But what about you? Will you be focusing more on understanding literature versus translation? Which one? In my case, I focus more on having the students understand literature. So where is your focus when it comes to teaching students to translate Korean literature?
Just as Professor Chung said, I think I'm somewhere in the middle. So because it's a literary translation, that's a basic assumption that we take when we take on the work, and it's not going to be classical literary works, but contemporary work from writers who are still alive. So we have been working exclusively with works from writers who are still alive. So sometimes we were able to meet with the writers themselves, and none of the questions were about the surface meaning of the work, but those discussions were focused more on understanding the literary body of work and their philosophy. And just as Ms. Yoon said earlier, I don't believe that the Korean proficiency level of the students matters as much. It doesn't seem to matter as much as the target language proficiency, because the students have a lot of time to prepare, and the instructors and professors lead them and guide them through translation of the text. And so there are many ways to help them better understand. However, if they don't have the target language Italian proficiency, that's something that's not going to be easily remedied. And another thing that I would like to share is that I haven't translated poetry, and I don't plan to do that either, because you have to have a high sense of or a very sensitive sensibility, and I don't think I have that, and I don't think that I'll be able to avoid distorting the meaning, and I don't want to have my students do something that I'm not going to be able to guide them through.
발표 잘 들었습니다.
Thank you very much for your responses. You know, if it weren't for the pandemic, we would be on site together. We would maybe meet up for some drinks even after the forum to discuss further. And I hope that that opportunity will come soon in the future. Yes, thank you very much.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Chung Gi-in, Professor Andrea de Benedittis, and Ms. Yoon Sun-mi. So that was a very specific and rich discussion on questions that we face while doing translation. And before we move on to the general discussion, we won't have a break before that. And I would like to extend my thanks to all of our participants who are staying with us to this hour. And while we are setting the stage for the general discussion, I would like to share a short story of myself. I translate poetry mostly. And as Professor Chung just said, translation is a very precise reading of the text. And I see that there's something very different from the students that I teach, from the students that I taught years ago. Students from English language speaking countries, currently, they would talk about a certain poet whose work they really enjoy and admire. So it's a much more voluntary effort, a much more voluntary absorption of Korean literature. And I think it's very encouraging to see that from the students. And deverbalization that was mentioned by Ms. Yoon is something that I always stress myself. Translators are very used to bilingual use. So it's very important to distance yourself from the two languages. So distancing yourself from the two languages is actually going to deliver a better translation. Now we will move on to the general discussion session. This will be moderated by Mr. Kwon Se-hoon, who was the former director of the Korean Culture Center in Germany. And all of our presenters will be joining either online through Zoom or here in the conference room. So we will be having the general discussion and the Q&A session together. And I would like to pass over the microphone to Ms. Director Kwon. Good evening. My name is Kwon Se-hoon, and I'm going to be the moderator for this general discussion and Q&A session. So we're running on a very tight schedule since 7 p.m. in Korea. We're not seeing each other face to face, but we can feel all of these enthusiasm online as well. So the participants online, we see around 130 people. And though we regret that we have this only online, if we have a lot of participants from overseas, then that would be actually a blessing that this situation has brought on us. Now let's go on into the discussion. So the literature from one country to meet readers from another language-speaking country, it has to go through translation and publication, and that's something that we are all well aware of. As Professor Kim Uchang mentioned in his keynote lecture, translation starts from curiosity on the unfamiliar, the unknown. But Korean literature faced many challenges in this regard because it's a minority language, and also there was not much awareness of Korean literature in other language-speaking markets, so it's two layers of obstacles. So in 2001, LTI Korea was established, and government funds were provided to help promote Korean literature overseas. The Literary Translation Academy is also a part of that effort. And the focus of this year's conference is about literary translation education. And we heard presentations from the National Center for Writing of the UK and also from the Literary Translation Fund from Germany, and we also had presentation from Korea and from the University of Naples of Italy. And the participants here, some of them are currently translators, but some of them may also be prospective, aspiring translators who are taking the academic classes. Korean literature is a minority literature, but at the same time, through this very unique phenomenon of Hallyu and Korean wave, we see there is a rising interest overseas in Europe and in other regions on Korean culture and Korean literature. So this question goes to all of the presenters. So current translators of Korean literature and aspiring translators of Korean literature, what is your outlook? Do you have any advice to give to aspiring literature translators, Korean literature translators, based on your experience overseas? And I would also like to hear more about the cooperation that you are doing with LTI Korea. And University of Naples also has some vacancy professorships to fill. Do you have any expectations or things that you would like to see for more help from the Korean government or LTI Korea?
네, 약간 선생님께서 말씀하시는 거하고 동역하고 겹쳐서.
So again, I'm not sure that I understood the question very well because I could hear the Korean along with the translation as well. I'll have to remove my earphones. I think we should have these discussions on a more regular basis. And of course, we would welcome very much more support from the Korean government because we want to build up the Korean Studies Department and studies. So LTI Korea up to now has been very helpful up to now. So you have discovered writers and you have supported us in building this program. And we are very satisfied with the cooperation that we are having with LTI Korea. However, because we have a growing body of students, we would like to have more professors to respond to that demand. And one of your questions was asking for advice of a local perspective as a translator. I believe that Korean books are quite excellent. I usually go to Kyobo bookstore whenever I go to Korea. I spend a lot of time there. The quality of Korean books are really high. And from the time I was a student, I always wanted to share and show those high-quality books to Italian readers and European readers, and that was a personal aspiration for myself. And also discovering and nurturing translators, competent translators, is a very urgent task that I think we all have to fulfill.
And perhaps Mr. Becker or Mr. Gribble on some recommendations or suggestions that you would like to have LTI Korea, support you with or promote in order to have great collaboration?
Certainly, I'm very happy to offer some thoughts. I think that, again, I would like to thank LTI Korea for our partnership in recent years and stress that their work and their commitment has been really critical to the growing interest around Korean literature and the stories coming from Korea, both contemporary and historical, over recent years. And their work has really built the foundations for that here. And we're very keen that those foundations are maintained and that they are built on, and we develop further conversations and possibly some additional routes to exchange, to sharing best practice, to talking about pedagogy, to understanding how technology can help us collaborate to make more stories travel. I think that when we talk to translators at the start of their career, or even before they've started really being translators, we try and emphasize that a literary translator does not take words from one language into the next. They perform a text, they read a text, they act like the Greek god Hermes and they carry cultural messages across the globe. They are activists, they are door openers, they are cultural messengers that are really critical for the future of our cultural sharing and understanding. So they can make a career in literary translation mean a lot of different things. It's a really exciting opportunity to follow, and helping support a broad range of people into that career is a really great shared ambition for all of us who work in the area.
Yeah, may I add something? The situation in Germany is that we have very few translators from Korean to German. And especially in our programs to support beginners, we don't have too many applicants from Korean to German. There are more or less none of them. Now this year there's one which we could join in our seminar, in our beginners seminar, but there are very few. So we should identify maybe a few more people to get a critical mass of people to do something. And I think that it would also make sense to work in the vice versa methods, to work together, the Korean translators of German literature, the German translators of Korean literature, to make something together. This is a model we have done with a lot of constellations, in bilingual constellations, and that helped to build up a kind of a collaboration space. Yeah, and I think this would make sense to make stronger. Also with the support of our organization and the LTE.
네, 세 분께서 한국문학.
So the three presenters have talked about more collaboration with LTI Korea, and also they have spoken of the tasks that are assigned to the potential aspiring translators. And we also have professors at the Translation Academy as presenters or discussants. And one thing that was raised in the presentations was one limitation of a minority language. So the work has to be translated and has to be a good publisher, and then it has to meet the reader. So experts on Korean literature and also the role of agents will have to be very important. And because we don't have that foundation in place, it's oftentimes that the translator has to look for a publisher themselves and sign a contract. And I would like to ask if there is going to be an opportunity to deal with this issue in translation education. So will this nurturing of agents or these relations be possible in the Translation Academy? Well, maybe we could have a special lecture on that topic. We could have special lectures on publishing industry. We actually have those special lectures that are given by people from the publishing industry. The students, of course, want to know how to make their debut as literary translators. And of course, I will have to share my own experience in those courses. So sometimes you get funding for translation, but it's not able to find a publisher, and there would be many reasons as to why. And I have been frustrated by that issue quite a lot of times myself. We see that most of the publishers just published the book because there was a translation grant, but they don't promote that book. They're not interested in actually selling the book. The book is just piled up and kept in storage, and it just isn't let out into the open very much. And I was frustrated in this situation multiple times. So I have taken personal initiative to try to remedy this situation. But I believe that LTI Korea perhaps could discover more publishers that are interested in publishing Korean literature and also maybe develop and nurture such publishers. I am interested in planning and producing and editing books, but we find that the foreign publishers rarely know anything about Korean literature, so it's a great challenge. But we believe that there will be improvements in the future. And translators will have to go hunting for publishers. It's going to be a good experience for themselves as well. And because they also get to learn about the publishing market in the process, and they will find what are the qualifications for a good publisher. So we can think across many directions.
As part of the translation education, maybe it seems that it's very difficult to include that as part of the regular course in translation education, right? I think that's what you were saying. And I was formerly a head of the Center of Korean Culture in another city, and Kim Young-ha is a well-known novelist in Korea, and I went to a publisher in Berlin to try to get his works translated and published. And Kim Young-ha was not a proven or vetted writer, and the publisher said, therefore, we're not able to include him in one of the collection of short stories that we are planning to publish. So I had that issue. And I think translators also come up against this type of obstacle when they try to work with foreign publishers. And of course, LTI Korea is working very hard to improve the situation. But currently, LTI Korea seems to be focused on educating translators, but perhaps we could LTI Korea could take a further step to try to nurture more network and relationships with international publishers. That would be one of the recommendations. And also, we received some questions from the students of the Translation Academy here in Korea. So we have speakers from UK, Germany, and Italy. So the question is, so there's curiosity about Korean cultural contents, and do you actually have case examples where this is quite tangible, that you feel this increased curiosity for Korean cultural contents? For example, in UK, you mentioned that Deborah Smith's translation of The Vegetarian had a great success, and has that led to an increased interest in the Korean literature? That would be one of the questions.
Yes, I think that has certainly been the case. I think that there has been an increase in awareness of Korean film and literature, and also food and culture. There's been, I think, in the last 5 years, a noticeable increase in the general kind of awareness of and interest in a whole range of cultural offerings coming from Korea within the UK. I think within publishing, it's a very specific set of interests which have been led. I think it's very interesting to note that the interest has started from the grassroots, from those translators, from those people who have connections with the contemporary literature scene in Korea, people like Deborah Smith, people like Han Kang, people like Bae-Soo Ah, who came to Norwich in 2017 and who I think has been working in Germany quite a lot. And there are individuals who drop rocks into the pool and the ripples spread out and they get amplified. And slowly but surely, when the translators find out about it, they campaign and they get work into small presses, and then small presses sell on their rights to bigger presses, and then bigger presses sell on the rights further to the big book fairs, and there's a knock-on effect. And it is growing over the last 5 years in the UK.
네. 제가 되게 한국
Yes.
한국 문학 작품들이 얼마나 팔리는지 저도 무척 궁금해요.
I also wanted to know how well Korean literature translations were selling,
말씀드렸지만 출판사에서 이런 정보를 공개하지 않고
and the publishers aren't really sharing this data, so I wasn't able to check. But based on my experience as a translator, I found in the past when I translated a work, it was very hard to find a publisher because Italian publishers, in particular the major, larger publishers, were not interested in Korean literature. But now I see that the situation has changed very much. Actually, publishers are having a hard time getting enough translators. So they found a lot of Korean works that they want to translate and publish, but they find a deficit, not enough translators. So Korean literature is more widely recognized, so I think there's quite a positive aspect there. Any examples from Germany?
Well, we have, of course, Han Kang, The Vegetarian. I think this translation was a success as well. And I think it was after the success in the English-speaking world, of course. This is also always the beginning of a world success. Maybe in this context, there will be more translation now, and there is a little bit more interest in Korean literature as well. And I would also say that what Chris said, that the interest in Korean culture in general is rising. But still, we don't have too many publishing houses, big publishing houses that translate Korean literature. We have small publishers with a special focus on East Asian literature, for example, but they don't reach the big public, yeah, and this is a problem I see. And yeah, that's the situation at the moment. So if you're a beginner as a translator of Korean literature and you prepare an expose and you offer this to a publisher, it's really hard work to approach and the publishers and to find interest in a translation. Yeah.
예.
Yes, so Korean literature, there's a rising awareness and recognition. However, we still have many problems to overcome because there's not a lot of interest from the publishers in many countries. So the students from the academies, we were talking earlier about the importance of the proficiency in the target language. And going forward, what kind of training should prospective students of the academy obtain before they leave their mother countries to come to participate in the academy? If I may, we were talking about the situation in UK, Germany, and Italy, but we weren't talking about France. And the activist translators in France have been promoting Korean literature very much in France, and we see that compared to 25 years ago, a lot of Korean literature works have been translated in France. Kim Young-ah, Han Gang, Hwang Seok-young, most of their major works have already been translated, and tens of thousands of copies have already sold. So we see that in France, publishers are looking for translators to translate specific words. And more recently, women writers' work is finding much interest in the French publishing market. And I am very happy to see that as one of those translator activists. And I was also teaching from the very early stages of the academy at LTI Korea. And I was very happy to hear today that literary translation and promoting Korean literature overseas, I see that we are very much on the same page, all of the speakers here. And as Ms. Yoon Sun-mi said, deverbalization, this concept was developed at ESIT, the Translation and Interpretation Graduate School in Paris, and that is aiming for idiomatic and natural translation and interpretation. I'm making sure that I'm not speaking too fast because our colleagues are in the interpretation booth. And that was a theory that was made at ESIT in Paris, and that is being applied very widely in our literary translation classes. And so we have nurtured a lot of translators who are currently active in the market. And Ms. Yoon said that students might have difficulty in understanding Korean texts, but in the French Academy course, we have French students and Korean students, so they are able to help each other when they are working on their assignments. And the students that we have trained, they have won a lot of new translator awards, and they are also taking commissions from French publishers to publish Korean works into France. And I'm very happy to see those accomplishments. And just to share a few of my own perspectives as someone who has been in the teaching in the academy for quite a long while. It takes a while for the students to actually be able to work on their own, to translate. And up to now, we haven't trained them on joint translation work. And foreign students are also very much engaged in revising and editing work, but we haven't been able to focus our teaching on revising education. So perhaps that's something that we could improve. And also, we should have more opportunities to teach students about editing. And Director Kwon talked earlier about the very important role of the agent. And I believe that Ms. Yoon might agree with me. In Anglo-American markets, the agent plays a very important role, but other European languages, the agent's role is not that important. And sometimes the agents only raise the license price, and sometimes they hinder the communication between the translator and the publisher. But nevertheless, compared to 25 years ago, at least in the French market, thanks to the activist translators, most of all, and the role of LTI Korea and also the translators and the French publishers, I see a lot of positive, fruitful result.
I actually was asking for some advice on for the aspiring translators, and I think some of that was embedded in the answers. But of course, you could look at the LTI Korea Academy's website for more tips for aspiring translators. So. So it appears that Mr. Chung wanted more time to ask more questions. So if you have a further question, actually one of my disappointments is that we are not able to have some wine and dine time after the forum like we used to in the past. But anyway, I have often translated poetry, as I mentioned, and as I taught my students, oftentimes I felt the sense of distance or a strangeness of the Korean language. And so in the case of poems, unless you have this, great proficiency of the Korean language, it's very, very difficult to start translating poetry. But I guess for fiction, it might be a little bit different because in poetry, you really have this great focus on the language itself, and you really but of course, you have to have this translate into target text, which needs to be read, right? Yes, of course. So I understand the importance of target text and target language proficiency. But when I was teaching, I wanted not only to teach how to translate Korean text, but I really wanted students to really appreciate the beauty of the Korean language. So that was a prime focus for my course. And I think that helped my students really pick up on Korean proficiency. And I think this is something that I'd like to talk more about, but in the interest of time, I'll have to stop my comment. Finally, I would like to invite Ms. Kwak Hyun-ju, who works at the academy here. She would like to also provide some feedback.
I am the head of the Translation Education Department at LTI Korea. My name is Park Hyun-ju, and Director Kwon was moderating this discussion session. So we were talking about whether there are any courses at the academy about foreign publishing. So this academy has been in place for the past 10 years, and most of the focus has been placed on training translators. But while we offer these courses, the aspiring translators, of course, they have to learn about the status of publishing overseas, and they have been studying how publishing takes place. So beginning this year, we are inviting special lectures from foreign publishers. We have done that twice, and we are planning programs that will have more of those lectures. And another thing that I would like to add is the graduates of our academy up to now, they have to go on translating, and we, of course, are making many efforts to continue to provide them with translation grants, but we have been lacking up to now. So another program that we have devised this year is to have our most outstanding academy graduates to join in internships at overseas publishers. So we were able to make such arrangements with 2 publishing agents overseas. We have our academy graduates working as interns over there, and 3 or 4 years ago from that time, I have invited people from overseas publishers to be able to talk with our Academy students in showcase programs. And from 2 years ago, the students in the academies would translate works, of course, and their translated works, they wanted to know, of course, whether their translation is going to be acceptable by a foreign publisher. So they would send their translated manuscripts overseas to a prominent publisher, which would provide feedback. So that's a more recent program that we have installed. So I would just wanted to update everyone on that. So the students at the academies, I think that's going to be very good news. And I have worked for more than a decade at LTI Korea myself, and the very presence of LTI Korea is about not leaving translation of Korean literature to chance, but it's more a committed, a more aggressive stance to promote and translate Korean literature. So I would like to extend my thanks to President Kim Sa-in of LTI Korea and the staff of LTI Korea, and also all of the participants and people who have helped make this event possible. With that, I would like to close the general discussion.
네,
Thank you very much, Mr. Kwon, for moderating the plenary discussion. I would like to also thank the speakers who have joined from abroad via Zoom. And I would also like to thank all the participants who have watched the entire proceedings. Now, I would like to add some comments. The LTI Korea, in the case of the underrepresented languages, we have not been able to work so hard with these underrepresented language thus far, but we have a program where we would specifically choose an underrepresented language and the text to be translated, and some of those have been published. And in my case, it took a very long time for me to be established as a translator, and I share my personal experience so that the aspiring translators to just take some time and not expect to become a rising star all at once. And I do a lot of translation of poems, and Kim Hae-sun, and she received Uchang Poetry Award, and Hysteria also received another award. So I cite this example to show that poetry is an area that also has promising opportunities for translators, not just fiction. So I would like to encourage many aspiring translators look into opportunities in the poetry sector. Now, I have participated in the Translators Conference several times, but this year this took place remotely and virtually. And despite that limitation, we had very in-depth discussion. Last year, there was the Korean Literature Showcase event, and we talked a lot about publishing, getting Korean translations published. But this year, I think we had a very fruitful discussion on how to promote practices and the education of literary translation. And despite the pandemic that limits our activities, we hope that what we're doing will continue to travel to other countries and other cultures so that different people can come together. And I think our translation can be an invitation for many people around the world. And I hope the discussions that we had today could lead to some real fruits so that a lot of translated works can reach readers far away from Korea. And I hope to see a growing body of aspiring translators to take an interest in translating Korean literature. Thank you very much for staying with us till very late into the night. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening or your day. Thank you.